The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. Marcus Aurelius. This quote is key to the central themes regarding the despondent dissatisfaction of Daria, both the character and the show itself. In a world that's rapidly changing and evolving, often the only way one can avoid being left behind by their peers is to chase the same trends they chase and to follow along with what the majority of people do. But those ever-changing and absurd trends can feel at once overwhelming and underwhelming. Overwhelming in trying to find out what everyone else is doing and then to copy it, and underwhelming to realize that wearing the same clothes as everyone else, watching the same TV, keeping the same hobbies, and so on, doesn't make you a more fulfilled person, as people are connecting not with you personally, but with the fake aspects of your personality that you're projecting. In 1995, MTV wanted to expand their demographic and ran a series of pilots that included Daria, a spin-off revolving around a foil character from the satirical Beavis and Butthead. It performed well with a younger demographic, as well as with the female audience, two groups that the network was less able to capture than they had hoped. And despite a bit of ambivalence about these groups, others argued that college students don't really watch much television anymore, and soon Daria was approved as a means of reaching a crowd the network had not captured up to the point. But Daria arguably bit off a bit more than the network could chew, being a show that rejected so many of the other norms and embraced uniqueness, no matter how unpopular you became as a result. To this day, it's still remembered fondly, both by the original fans of the show and those who came along decades later to find a message that still resonated after decades of societal changes have occurred. But it's not as though this message was especially new or groundbreaking. After all, I started the video by quoting a philosopher from the 70s. Not the 1970s, not the 1870s, the 170s. It's a sentiment that has existed for nearly as long as philosophical thought has, and yet one that seems to be forgotten about time and time again, as counterculture becomes counterculture becomes culture, and so on. This retrospective will be split up into individual episode retrospectives, which themselves are split into first a recap of the events of the episode, followed by a more proper review of what the episode's metatextual relationship with the audience was. As each of these segments are roughly 2 to 3 minutes long, I've titled the video Brief, because it genuinely is much shorter than it could have been. Season 1. The first major obstacle that Daria had to overcome was one shared by both the titular character and the show itself: making distance from Beavis and Butthead. As such, early promotional material only made passing reference to the original show in order to allow Daria to stand on her own. As much as this was a technical spin-off of Beavis and Butthead, it was not a spiritual one. What also defines Season 1 is a bit of the scuff of an unrefined product, totally normal for any series. Daria showed practically no inflection in her voice, something that reinforced her character but also made her somewhat one-note and lacking in the nuance that would make the later seasons of the show much more interesting. Jane's voice also lacked some of the character that it would have in later seasons, most notably being far less nasally, for lack of a better term. And other members of the cast, notably those from the background, had much less thought put into who they would be in favor of extras in Daria's story. Esteemsters. The Morgendorfer family moves into a new suburb, Lawndale, where Quinn quickly becomes accepted while pretending her sister Daria is unrelated. Daria's sarcastic attitude gets the attention of the school who, after giving her a psychological evaluation, finds her to have low self-esteem. So she gets sent to a special class for other students with the same esteem issues, where she meets Jane Lane, a girl who shares her lack of interest in the banality of suburban life. Embracing this, the two start to use the obsession the adults in their life have with their esteem to manipulate them into doing things they don't want to, like eating pizza at a kid's restaurant. Eventually, the bit gets old, so Jane and Daria pass their class by telling Mr. O'Neill exactly what he wants to hear. But they do this too well, and the girls are recognized for passing the esteem class faster than anyone ever has. Jane takes the opportunity to make fun of the entire presentation, while Daria leans into the corny sentimentality of it all, before exposing Quinn as her sister, and then making the family go to a UFO convention to celebrate. Self-esteem is something that's impossible to measure in an objective way, but this doesn't stop schools from trying. Most often this manifests as a tool to measure conformity instead, trying to make the accomplishments and achievements of one person line up with the accomplishments that are so universal as to be meaningless. Self-esteem is meant to be derived from traits that make you unique, so the entire concept of a graded self-esteem test means that you'll be following a rubric and thus incapable of finding genuine happiness in lieu of being graded on how well you conform. As Daria herself states, she does not have low self-esteem, she has low esteem for everyone else. But in a world where everybody is trying their best to fit in with those around them, to have a lack of respect for societal norms means to lack respect for the people following them and vice versa. But rather than taking it as a personal attack that it's meant to be, the world views Daria as being the problem. Surely, if everybody is following a trend, it must be the right trend to follow. So then the only ones who aren't following along must wish that they were. In the end, you're not going to fundamentally change who you are just because you resent yourself for being an outsider. At best, this sort of socially enforced wellness doesn't make people happy, but rather, it makes people good at pretending they're happy. The Invitation. A popular cheerleader is hosting a party to celebrate her family being out of town, and she invites all of the popular students from school, and also Daria, as she helped out with her art assignment. Quinn is angry that Daria might go to the party and hurt her popularity, which makes Daria decide to go after all, bringing Jane along so she can get away from her brother's guitar practice. Daria is able to get Jane into the party by telling the gate guard she's a hired artist, and they arrive to a tour from the sleazy Upchuck. Jane is able to go to the laundry room with the guy she meets, but Daria entertains herself by telling Quinn's group of sycophants embarrassing childhood stories. Eventually, Daria and Jane leave to go troll rich people by pretending to be authority figures, leaving Quinn to start a fight among her followers for attention before the party gets broken up by the police and they resign to a ride home from Upchuck. The entire premise of this episode, insofar as how the characters behaved, is contrived due to expectations of what ought to be. The popular kids throw a party because it seems like the thing they ought to do. People go to the party not to relax, but to show that they fit in enough to be at a party. And the only ones who seem to be having a good time are the ones trying to actively hurt other people's experience, either by exploiting their hormone-riddled minds or blind obedience to hierarchies, being they social, like the popular kids versus the outsiders, or legal, like Daria and Jane telling people what to do because they have a policeman's hat. In the end, Daria's disinterest results in a pervasive idea that she probably won't be invited to the next big party because she didn't make enough of an impression of wanting to be there. And so the end result of popularity is self-perpetuating. If you're popular, you can use your status to become popular. If you're not, then you have to work to become popular for the sake of popularity. The popular kids aren't spending time together because they genuinely enjoy the company of each other, but because they're taking chances to be judgmental enough to tear others down, all for the grand prize of getting to do it over again. College Board. After an eye-opening trip by the Morgendorfers to a family friend who's prepping their 3-year-old for college entrance exams, the parents decide to send Daria and Quinn to a college prep course. There, they daydream about their ideal college experiences before learning of a mandatory trip to a college for a tour. They're brought to Middleton, the alma mater of their parents, and begin a tour, though Helen and Jake leave to visit the old dorm room, while Quinn takes a visit to a Greek house party. Only Daria follows the tour guide, who gives up on the tour as the rest are disinterested and takes Daria to see the real college experience, ultimately showing her a career opportunity in writing papers for the students there. She eventually meets up with Quinn, who's been elected keg queen by a group of frat boys despite not even having a learner's permit, and soon the police show up, alongside a panicked Helen and Jake, getting the family kicked off the campus. In the end, Daria doesn't get to keep the money she made as her mother doesn't want to discourage dishonesty, and Quinn learns that her acceptance letter was not to a real school, nor is there a such thing as a make-out scholarship. Colleges initially started out as a relic of older times, back when education, let alone higher education, was reserved for the wealthy elite. Colleges were essentially social clubs for young adults with generational wealth, and very little has changed since then except for the reality but not self-image of those attending. People will go into decades of debt to study at a college only to get a job looking at Excel spreadsheets in an unrelated field. Education itself is run like a business, trying to get as much money out of the people as possible instead of acknowledging that an educated population is meant to be a net benefit for the good of society. And most of the prospective attendees already know this. Nobody's college daydreams actually involved being more intelligent and fulfilled versions of themselves. They were enamored with an idealized version of campus life or obsessed with eschewing education altogether. This and the fact that fewer than a third of Americans actually wind up pursuing a higher education is enough to call into question why high schools are so insistent on sending most of their graduates to college in the first place if it's a lifestyle that doesn't mesh well with so many people's best interests. But then again, this same lack of logic applies to so many other things in society, so why not push people to be like everyone else, regardless of if it's a good idea? Cafe Disaffecto. The Lawndale Cyber Cafe is broken into with a computer being stolen, and Mr. O'Neill tries to get the students interested in starting a campaign to reopen it. Daria doesn't care until her parents threaten her with a summer music camp, so she volunteers to fundraise, bringing Jane along to take pictures of the inside of people's homes. The students of Lawndale then go door to door, trying to convince people to spend their money, with Quinn managing to raise the most by flirting with potential customers. When Daria refuses to sell chocolate to a hypoglycemic woman, she's kicked off of her fundraising duties and asked to do a performance on opening night instead. Realizing that the other students there likely won't appreciate something more intellectual, she instead decides to write a piece of right-wing anti-communist schlock that incites the crowd into a mob. Afterwards, the cafe is once again broken into. Daria gives a tongue-in-cheek warning to her father about the types of hate groups that might attempt to incite us into violence we would normally never commit on our own, meant to reflect the way in which she was forced to volunteer at the cafe, despite having no interest in doing so. But it's not just the lack of interest that prevented her from working, but later a moral objection to selling chocolate bars to a woman who just passed out in front of them, and showed signs of desperation to get even more. But when Daria gets in trouble for not complying with the fundraiser, it's not so much that she had these objections, but that she wasn't cooperating with everyone else. She wasn't in trouble for refusing a manslaughter charge, but for not fitting in enthusiastically enough. And so what better way to fight against criticisms of being unenthusiastic than to show what that kind of blind obsession can do to a crowd of impressionable teenagers? Daria uses anti-communist rhetoric and fear-mongering to make people become very, very excited about stamping out Russian influence in their wealthy upper-class suburb. And she winds up making the school look bad in a way they don't have the justification to criticize, because if they did, then you could accuse them of lacking enthusiasm. Mold. Daria's economics teacher takes the class to the mall in order to show them economic theories in person, and in spite of her parents' complaints about the distance, she ends up going. Daria gets a bit sick from the bus fumes on the way over, as well as the antics of some of the other students, and when they arrive, they're quickly funneled into a labyrinthian maze of various colored zones before arriving at a not-so-subtle focus group. The mall executives bribe the class to stay quiet by giving them gift certificates that Jane and Daria then take around to exchange for cash under the guise of classwork. Eventually, they find Quinn and the rest of the fashion club skipping class to look around the mall, and Daria blackmails her for a ride home before attempting to find out what her gift certificate was for, only to then have her picture taken as the 10,000th customer of a doodad store. In the end, they return home having learned nothing, and the Morgendorfer parents offer to take the two back. Malls existed as a middle step between the age of the box store and online retail, a place where one could buy everything, and you were sold more so on the experience of spending money than whatever it was you were actually spending money on. It's actually a bit scary to me that this is something worth explaining, but as they no longer have nearly the cultural impact that they once did, I find it necessary because about 40% of my audience is under 25. Malls never really had the staying power so many investors in them assumed they would. They build them on the assumption that there would be a perpetual return on the initial investment. Naturally, as soon as the first recession of the aughts occurred, people pulled out so quickly that malls these days are mostly vacant lots, planned for demolition, or barely scraping by on a handful of supergiant anchor stores. And so they serve as a microcosm of the American capitalist system as it existed in its era. And from the cultural impact they had, and then lost, we can see parallels in modern society. For example, many office parks these days are rented out to businesses that have, as of a few years ago, shifted to a larger work-from-home culture. The investors in these office buildings are no longer making rent money, and thus, many office buildings are shutting down entirely as the push to return to cubicles is failing in the face of work-life balance. And just as Daria exists to act nonplussed at the excessive consumerism of the mall, we all feel a similar indifference to the collapsing office space market. This year's model. The Amazon modeling agency arrives at Lawndale High under the invitation of the principal, and they begin to scout the students for potential modeling contracts. Many of the students are enthusiastic about potentially becoming a model, but Daria is particularly outraged over the exploitation of the industry being brought so close, made worse when Quinn declares that she's been invited to participate in a class. Daria agrees to watch after Quinn on the condition that her parents stop trying to remodel her room, and she arrives at the event to hopefully see her sister humiliated. Trent arrives as well to get the experience with models, and Brittany laments that she wasn't chosen for being too booksome, and complains even more when Kevin is invited up to serve as an accompaniment for the other models. But when Quinn is asked to rub the bare chest of a boy, she decides she won't cross that line and leaves, only for the principal to realize what's going on and call the whole thing off, but not before Daria invites a few mercenary recruiters to the school to make the administration look even worse. Modeling and fashion are industries that have done irreparable damage to the self-worth of so many young women, but then again this isn't an especially new or groundbreaking observation to make, even in 1997. What's concerning then is the fact that everyone was aware of the way in which modeling agencies normalized unrealistic body types, and then proceeded to ignore this in favor of trying to attain those standards anyway. And sure, people are free to try to achieve whatever dream they want to. All dreams come with some sacrifice, whether it's enduring concussions and brain damage to be a star athlete, eschewing a social life to become valedictorian, or forcing yourself to stop eating to achieve a model's physique. Jody even has a brief discussion with Daria to this effect when the latter tries to poke some sarcasm at the former for attempting to lose weight. And so this is where the real insidious ideas comes into play. People are free to pursue goals that hurt themselves directly, as it's their body to do what they choose with. But these goals often end up leaving others out through the very nature of the predatory way in which body images are manipulated. Supporting an industry that has a vested interest in making people feel self-conscious in part makes you culpable for these damages, and the fact that the mainstream opinion is to both acknowledge and dismiss this realization is one of the few things that gets Daria angry enough to actively speak out against it. The Lab Brat. Miss Barch assigns her science class a project on positive or negative reinforcement, putting students into pairs to create a maze for a mouse. Daria is paired with Kevin, much to the horror of Brittany, who's paired with Upchuck. Upchuck uses a photo he took of the head cheerleader with the captain of the rival football team to blackmail her into doing his chores while he does the project, though Brittany also repeatedly tries to check up on Kevin. She mostly finds Kevin sitting on the couch at Daria's, watching the Pigskin channel while Quinn, and even Jake, try to suck up to the guy. Eventually, Brittany's jealousy gets the better of her when a rumor starts to spread about Kevin dating one of the Morgendorfer girls, and she kidnaps the mouse used in their experiment. Daria is able to threaten Brittany to get the mouse back by saying she and Kevin will have to do a lengthy makeup experiment if they fail, and she winds up using the traumatized mouse as an example of negative reinforcement, getting a perfect score while Kevin gets a D for having done none of the work. Meanwhile, Upchuck and Brittany also fail due to not splitting the workload. This episode plays out like a stereotypical teen drama plot involving a rapidly expanding love triangle, with the exception that one of the focal characters has absolutely no interest in reciprocating any of the drama. As such, it shows how contrived many of these dynamics can be, that instead of the logical progression of the plot in response to actions by the characters, people will perform the actions they assume they ought to, without any input forcing them to do so. Daria is not playing the same game as the other girls, so they wind up competing with what they imagine is going to happen instead of the reality, and if your opponent doesn't show up, there's no way to win outside of default. But it's not just Daria who's not playing the drama game, but Kevin as well. He watches sports on the TV the whole time and has no real concern with what the women around him are doing, which, instead of resulting in them giving up on chasing something that's not there, makes them double down to try to get his attention even more. At a certain point, you have to stop responding to a lack of stimuli, something that even the rats in the experiment figured out, but not the vapid cheerleader types who start to create drama for drama's sake. Pinch Sitter. Quinn schedules a date for the same night she had an arrangement to babysit, so she passes off the responsibility onto Daria, largely so Daria can get out of a couples therapy session hosted at the Morgendorfer household, while Helen takes her to a session on time management. At this lesson, she gets a personal planner that she becomes obsessed with and begins to grade the guy she's dating, until he discovers the scheduled breakup. Meanwhile, Daria babysits the Gupty children, Tad and Trisha. They're extremely well behaved, with a series of wholesome activities planned down to the minute for the night. But after Daria calls Jane over for relief, the two work on some creative retellings of fairy tales that wind up deprogramming the kids and teaching them to think for themselves. They ultimately agree not to tell their parents they stayed up all night watching TV after they come up from the couple's therapy session with Jake. Afterwards, Daria writes a paper on indoctrination, using her experience from babysitting that her teacher appreciates even if some of the research could be considered a felony. There's a bit of irony in the message of teaching somebody to think for themselves, in that you can't really be told not to do what other people tell you to do without yourself having done something another person told you to do. The closest similar message that can be taught is to question authority. Not so much the things authority figures are telling you to do, but questioning why they specifically are the ones saying it, what gives them the right to do so, and what motivation they might have to get you to follow their rules. It's completely possible that an authority figure could turn out to be reasonable, but you won't know that unless you test it first. After all, proper authority is derived from legitimate sources that can't simply be toppled with a bit of questioning into their legitimacy, and thus, it's only the illegitimate authority figures who are afraid to answer a few questions about what gives them the right. This is the difference between a parent saying, "because I said so," and the way Daria and Jane treat the Gupty children. Jane is proud of the kids for pointing out some of her more outlandish lies, because it means that they aren't interpreting the mistrust authority message to instead trust a different source of authority, but instead to mistrust authority established for the sake of itself. Too cute. A girl named Brooke gets a nose job and Quinn becomes an outcast for not complimenting it enough, eventually escalating to the point where she believes that she needs plastic surgery to fit in again. She calls Daria out of class for emotional support while she goes to a local plastic surgeon's, having a model of her face made with a series of touch-ups, while the surgeon also tries to encourage Daria to get her face redone to look like Quinn's. Daria rejects this offer, so the surgeon sends her home with a pair of silicone boobs that Jane's excited to see. Quinn starts fundraising to get the money for her surgery, asking around the school, but getting no progress whatsoever, outside of Upchuck offering to rent the boob. In the end, Brooke's face collapses when the surgery is botched, and the rest of the girls start to fear for the future of their nose jobs, while Quinn is happy to have a natural face. In the B-plot, Miss Barch tries to break Kevin's ego by having him walk around in makeup to make him ugly, but he gets some sardonic advice from Daria to simply bribe people to like him instead. When looks are all you have, then looks are all you have. There's nothing to fall back on if and when they change, either because you've aged out of them or standards of beauty have become different. Here, the shallowness of beauty standards are shown when Quinn goes from popular to outcast, all because of a bit of pedantic communication. She's suddenly considered to have a problem with the size and shape of her nose, all because her friends decided they no longer like her. This is part of the fault of judging oneself by standards that are arbitrary and subjective. What's attractive to one person is different than what's attractive to another, so that social support is backed by an idea rather than something concrete, like status on a team and the like. And because physical beauty is basically the fiat currency of social standards, it's just as prone to being manipulated with the same styles of manipulation. If everybody gets a nose job, then the value of an ideally shaped nose is diminished. People stop liking you despite nothing changing about your appearance. Ultimately, Quinn's looks-driven popularity is shown to be demand-driven as well. She's not popular for looking good, she's popular for looking like everyone else. The Big House. Daria and Jane are caught out late, and their parents decide to enforce stricter rules on the two in order to instill some sense of discipline around the house. This includes what they refer to as family court, where Jake and Helen pretend to be a judge and prosecution while the girls defend themselves. Their lack of enthusiasm results in the two being grounded, confined inside for the next month. After a few nights of board games and harmonica playing, the Morgendorfers start to get annoyed with the effort it takes to sit around with their kids, and after Daria is caught sneaking out to watch a faculty versus DJ roller hockey game, with the hopes of seeing Mr. DiMartino have another heart attack, she's able to argue that her parents are spending too much effort on the grounding to be worth it, and Daria is able to get out of the sentence on an extremely loose parole. She then goes back to her normal life to dispel some of the rumors about the experiments her parents were running. The increasingly strict rules placed on Daria and Quinn are meant to be a form of justice, teaching them a sense of morality through discipline and creating a punishment structure to enforce this. But a large part of justice comes not from an arbitrary enforcement of rules, but stricter adherence to common sense. The success of a system is determined by the amount of effort it takes to reach that outcome versus the amount of good that comes from the effort. Jake and Helen are hoping to make Daria and Quinn more upstanding, but come to the conclusion that it takes far too much effort to achieve this goal than they're willing to put forth. A good system is one that minimizes the amount of work that has to be put in for a maximized amount of positive outcome. So when it becomes clear that the Morgendorfers are more concerned with the nature of the punishment than the implementation of it, Daria is able to exploit this disparity through malicious compliance. Do exactly what her parents expect of her until they realize that it's far easier to be hands-off than hands-on. Obviously, letting the kids run totally wild is not an ideal outcome, nor is a strict disciplinarian approach, so the best middle grounds are ones that you can actually achieve. It's hard to enforce a rule when you're at work well into the evening, so why bother? Road Worrier. Daria meets the band Mystic Spiral, though they're thinking of changing that, and finds herself unable to make any of her usual sarcastic quips around Trent, Jane's brother. He invites the two to Alternapalooza, and they plan on driving a beaten-up old van down there. Daria winds up bumping her head, getting stung by a bee, sitting on an old sandwich, and ultimately having to pee behind some bushes while they're waiting in traffic. But after their van breaks down and Jane leaves the two alone, Daria realizes that she's not being made fun of for any of this, and that Trent seems to be more down to earth than she had expected, and the two have a talk about following dreams for dreams' sake. Meanwhile, Quinn is also about to go to the rock festival with the fashion club, though they take a detour when they see an outlet mall along the way, and ultimately neither girl ends up actually seeing the concert, while their parents stay home to relive their 60s party phase. Daria in this episode deals with the blossoming feeling of a developing crush, the type of feeling one knows is manifesting when you find yourself unable to say the things you usually do, act the way you usually do, or reject the ideas you usually do. Daria starts to feel as though she might be judged, suddenly staying quiet as she's concerned with saying the wrong thing, despite this never being a concern in the past. The reason for this lack of concern was because she didn't care whether the average person liked her or not, but because she cares about Trent's opinion of her, she starts to keep who she is to herself. But in the end, this winds up being the wrong solution. After the stress of trying to look correct around him begins to combine with the stress of the various things going wrong with the road trip, such as car sickness, Daria finally runs out of the energy to keep her personality to herself and starts to say how she really feels. Then she's pleasantly surprised by the fact that she's not being judged harshly for this. This comes as a relief, as nothing makes a relationship feel closer than when you don't have to put up facades or fake personalities for another person. Daria has refrained from doing this her whole life, something that hasn't won her very many friends. Then she finally lets loose and acts like herself around a new group of people, only to find out that it was pointless to hold back. A good relationship is one where you feel like you don't have to hide your stuffed animals when they come over. The Teachings of Don Jake. When Jake bursts a blood vessel due to stress, Helen takes some mandatory time off of work to take the whole family into the woods for a relaxing vacation in nature. Daria and Quinn are taken along in spite of their issues with the trip, and they find themselves at the mercy of their father's ranting about his own dad, Mad Dog Morgendorfer, and his tough love style of parenting. The next morning, the family splits into groups for a hike, and Jake starts ranting about who he'll find in the woods, while Helen begins to hallucinate as well. Deducing that this is because of some bad berries, Daria looks for a way out, only to realize that her mother kept her cell phone on her in spite of her ideas about rejecting society, and she calls on help to get them out, only for the bill from the helicopter ride to burst blood vessels in both of his eyes. Meanwhile, Jane and Trent are sent to a family reunion to endure the abuse that brings the rest of their family together, though the next morning, they leave early to avoid playing croquet. This episode is the first glimpse we get into the history of Daria's father, Jake, and the emotionally distant father he grew up with, the kind of man to spend so long trying to toughen up his child, but never found the strength himself to be open with the kid. It's clear that Jake hasn't moved past his past, and yet he makes active strides not to pass on this sort of toxic parenting to his own children. Though this is at least in part due to having two daughters and thus no little man to try to corrupt to be like him. It's not as though parents shouldn't try to avoid challenging their children, though, just that there ought to be a connection between these challenges and the motivation behind them. To simply send a kid off to military school or throw him into a campsite unprepared won't do a lot of good if the reason for this lesson is not explained and there's not some kind of build-up to establish why it's necessary. Criticism, even personal criticism, must be done from a place of love, or else it comes across as mean-spirited in such a way as to be entirely dismissible. This is why, in the B-plot, the Lane children don't seem to mind some of the verbal abuse and criticism of their relatives, because they just don't care what those people think. The Misery Chick. Tommy Sherman, a former Lawndale quarterback and state champion MVP, visits his former high school as they're naming a new goalpost after him. While there, he either propositions or insults everyone he meets, eventually getting angry at Daria for not worshipping him, before she and Jane joke about how they wish he would die, and then he does after the goalpost falls down on him. Over the next few days, everybody starts to turn to Daria for advice she's reluctant to give as she resents being the misery chick at school. But Jane also starts to avoid her, and she tries to inquire as to why, eventually having a conversation about the way that Daria overthinks everything, and Jane doesn't want to think for a while, but that others turn to her because they did. In the end, Daria admits that she was being a bit too depressing about the whole incident, and acknowledges that it's okay to be vulnerable sometimes, and then begins to charge anyone who uses her as a therapist. Daria's persistence in rejecting common sentiment for her whole life seems to also be a rejection of the typical labels that people love to place on one another. She isn't a jock or a cheerleader or a geek or goth or anything else immediately identifiable. At least, so she thinks. The fact that her rejection of labels has wound up with her getting a label anyway means that her identity is less fluid than she believes it to be. And with the rigid identity comes a role to the name. Daria has become the misery chick, all because she refuses to show emotion unless it's completely necessary to do so, and as a result, people assume she's unfeeling. When the common way to feel is happy and someone is not happy, they get ignored and their lifestyle overlooked because of the misery. But when the common way to feel is sad and someone else isn't sad, then she becomes looked up to as others want to know how not to feel depressed, just like she is. But the reality of the situation is that Daria does feel emotions. It's showing them that she avoids doing. Everybody, even those closest to her, believe that she is some emotionless stoic and that they start to judge her for this, for better and for worse. Her own best friend begins to feel uncomfortable spending time around Daria because of this lack of empathy. It goes from an elevated sense of morality to a sense of psychopathy that Daria then has to disprove. At the end of the episode, she's able to publicly accept that there's an appeal to being vulnerable, that letting yourself be hurt means that you cared in the first place, and that her life choices weren't exactly what they seemed to be. Season 2. As with most transitions away from the first season of a show, Daria saw a slight upgrade to the style in which it was presented moving into its second season. A few background characters had their designs more normalized, and we've begun to see scripts that call for a specific personality to answer questions instead of Girl 1, Girl 2, and so on. This in turn means that so many of the side characters of Daria are now receiving more attention to their stories, as well as those of the main cast, and we begin to see development occur as these changes are placed in comparison to their Season 1 personalities. And this is where Daria starts to distinguish itself from other shows on the network, especially against Beavis and Butthead from where it came. Characters start to receive arcs and small developmental upgrades during episodes that persist. It's far from becoming a serialized show where missing one episode causes the viewer to miss out on plot beats, but it still has a greater respect for its own canon than the rest of MTV's animated lineup at the time. And this difference is something that will give the show a lot more acclaim moving forward. Arts and Crass. Lawndale hosts an art contest and asks all the students to participate, specifically seeking out the more artistic types, like Jane, to make submissions about student life in the 21st century. Jane collaborates with Daria to create an aesthetically pleasing image of a girl looking in the mirror to be accompanied by a gross poem about bulimia. The school likes the painting, but dislikes the poem and asks her to change it, though Jane and Daria refuse to accept this and stay firm. So the principal, Miss Lee, submits a rewrite of the poem involving healthy eating habits, and displays it at a conference against their will. Daria and Jane decide to retaliate by vandalizing their artwork, destroying it so it no longer has any message, and they're threatened with a call home, though when Helen answers the phone and learns what's been done, she argues it's a violation of the girls' civil liberties and threatens a lawsuit. In the end, Daria and Jane lose interest in the contest, which is won by Brittany for a vapid painting with no message. A consistent part of the belief system of Daria is that she seems to be one of the only people with an internal monologue. That is, she's one of the few people out there who seems to consider her actions in the context of themselves, and that she's self-aware in a way that so many others are not. This is a common way of thinking during adolescence, as it's also one that many people don't go out of their way to disprove. When you try so hard to fit in with other people, of course your actions are going to come across as purely instinctual, instead of being capable of common thought on your own. And artistic expression is perhaps the purest implementation of this sort of internal thought. People create art with the intention of getting some idea in their head out of their head, a way to make your internal monologue become external, so to speak. But not everybody views art this way. Some believe that the purpose of art is to tie a room together, to look nice and make a person feel nice, rather than challenging them or forcing them to feel a certain discomfort for a time. So to openly and quickly reject somebody else's perspective on the world is to say that you don't have one of your own to compare it to, and thus, the only type of person to get offended over artistic expression would be the kind of person who cannot think for themselves. The Daria Hunter. Lawndale High has a school field trip to a paintball range in order to learn about guerrilla warfare or something. While out there, they get split into two groups, though nobody besides Brittany is taking the conflict very seriously, as they care more about whatever squabbles they took with them on the trip. Helen gets into an argument with Miss Lee over Daria's attitude and whether it's the fault of the school or the parents. Jake and Mr. DiMartino drink and complain about their upbringing. Mr. O'Neill allows Miss Barch to vent to him, and she falls for his sensitivity. Quinn starts to threaten Sandy's position as the head of the fashion club, spurred on by Tiffany. And Daria and Jane leave early to see a great white shark exhibit that turns out to be a woman retelling the story of Jaws. In the end, Quinn gives up on actively sabotaging Brittany to hang out with her guy friends instead, and Daria and Jane leave to return to the trip as they're bored of the movie recap. In keeping with the trend that Season 2 establishes, this is an episode that has very little of an overarching plot, and exists more so to set up multiple character dynamics that will play a more pivotal role moving forward. The fashion club starts to have some more overt drama established, as they become Quinn's off-again, on-again friend circle, while we get a bit of backstory from some of the teachers, as well as seeing Mr. O'Neill become the sole good guy in Miss Barch's eyes. There's a continuing feud between the school's principal and Helen over whose fault it is that Daria is the way she is, with neither one agreeing on who's responsible, nor willing to say exactly what their problem is, at the risk of coming across as uncaring. It's fitting then that for this episode, Daria and Jane wander away to do something totally unrelated for the bulk of the episode. They listen to some pop culture regurgitation while everyone else is caught up in drama, not unlike the way that the two generally go home and watch Sick Sad World, while the rest of their peers argue over that week's plot. Even the plot of this episode winds up being quickly forgotten about, arguably before it even started, as Mr. DiMartino can't even keep his story straight on how shooting at his students and drilling them with military strategy is supposed to help anyone but himself. Quinn the Brain. Quinn is at risk of failing English class if she doesn't get an A on her next assignment, and after a failed pep talk from her parents, tries and fails to get Daria to write the essay for her. So Quinn writes it herself and, due to the low expectations, manages to get an A and have her essay published in the school paper. Quinn is then viewed as a brain for this, fearing for her reputation until she starts to realize that being a brain is actually making her more popular. Her parents reward her and the other students start to follow her fashion trends, much to the annoyance of her old fashion club, her old boyfriend, and especially Daria, who feels as though her identity is being stolen, and stolen badly. So Daria plots her revenge by dressing the way Quinn used to dress and inviting her boyfriends over, getting Quinn jealous enough to drop the smart girl facade and go back to the way things were, a condition that Daria's not especially proud of returning to. The people who start trends are rarely the people credited with starting trends. That honor goes to the first popular person to adopt it. Daria is an outcast. This is to her because she is a, quote, brain, the type of person to think too much about the world and thus be incapable of fitting in anywhere. Quinn is decidedly not a brain, but once people think that she is, her intelligence starts to become the source of her popularity as others begin to mimic her. Superficially, but as her intelligence was superficial in the first place, this is an accurate sort of affection. Quinn gets rewarded for things Daria has done her whole life, things she's even been punished for on occasion. So when the behavior of a person is the same as yours, but the reaction to that behavior is different, the real issue Daria has comes up. Perhaps there is something else to blame for her position in society. It clearly isn't her intelligence, after all. That's the entire reason Quinn is popular in this episode. So there's some deeper aspect of her personality that's pushing others away, something that goes far beyond the surface level of how she accepts being defined. Of course, this adoption being so superficial, all she has to do is pretend she plans to steal Quinn's old personality in order to get her to return to the way things were, where she can pretend to be a type of personality that's much easier to adopt instead of feigning intelligence like everyone else did. I don't. Daria's cousin Erin is getting married to a guy she barely knows with a lavish ceremony paid for by her grandmother that makes Helen resentful of all the favoritism her sister receives. Quinn and Daria are set to be bridesmaids, arriving at a fancy resort with a golf course that Jake is interested in playing. But once there, Daria meets her aunt Amy, who dresses and acts just like her, and the two sarcastically joke their way through the ceremony before ditching to eat cheese fries. Quinn gets hit on by a minister who eventually starts a fight with the groomsmen who wanted to flirt with Quinn instead. And Helen gets increasingly drunk, calling out her sister for being the favorite child before ultimately the two wind up sobbing about how much they love each other. Back at Lawndale, the school is hosting a wedding exhibition that makes Jody worry about the implications of selling weddings to high schoolers, while Brittany and Kevin bond over the flowers for sale, despite the latter embarrassing her over her modeling. Helen has always been portrayed as the hard-working matriarch of the Morgendorffer family, whose obsession with her work life often means she's oblivious to the inner workings of the minds of her children. This episode offers an explanation of why she is this way. She's merely been trying to overcome the lack of attention she's received growing up by working harder than her parents' favorite child. Rita, having always gotten more than Helen, is shown to actively need it. She remarries frequently, her financial situation is questionable. Basically, she needs all the help she can get. Ironically, Helen's attempts to be self-sufficient have wound up justifying the lack of extra care she should have had as a child, though it's a stretch to say that things would have turned out better for her had she been more incompetent. Even more ironic is the fact that through all their arguing over who's the favorite, they completely pass over their other sister, Amy, during the discussion, leaving her as a passive observer to the family drama, who's able to avoid it simply because it avoids her. The fact that Amy recognizes Daria as being similar to her and then opts to take Daria away from the wedding to go to a bowling alley instead shows an awareness of how this happens and a desire to preserve some good in the family tree, as well as making things look a bit more optimistic by showing that sibling rivalries happen all the time and you're not weird for having a love-hate relationship with your family. That was then. This is dumb. Helen and Jake host their friends from the 60s, Willow and Coyote, two people who haven't quite let go of their hippie lifestyle yet. Daria and Quinn hope to avoid the family for the weekend, though Quinn changes her mind when she meets Ethan and tries to stick around to flirt with him, as well as to find out some embarrassing stories to blackmail their parents with. Daria leaves to sell some of Jane's parents' old vinyl records, until Upchuck gives them an unsolicited salesmanship lesson and abandons the stand, which then gets ransacked. Back at the house, Willow and Coyote at first criticize the way in which the Morgendorffers have sold out, embodying exactly what they spent their youth fighting against. But after a bit of compositing and a few drinks, they finally break down and admit that they don't believe that strongly on their lifestyle anymore, with Coyote accepting a few investment tips from Jake, while Helen tells Willow she can just buy store-bought bread. In the end, Daria is about to get in trouble for blowing off her family until she asks her mother why she spent a night in jail in the 60s and the issue is dropped. As the Morgendorffers expose more and more of their commodified life to their old friends, they start to feel guilty over how little of their old minimalism they've actually embraced, due to moving beyond that phase. You can't really call yourself dedicated to a cause if you drop the sacrifices you've made for that cause the moment something better comes along. But as the episode goes on, we learn that Coyote and Willow resent their current lifestyle, that part of the reason they still act like hippies is because they haven't had the good fortune to be able to sell out yet, and that they'd happily take the button-down suburban life they criticize so much if given half a chance. Daria and Trent have a conversation during this episode about the voluntary minimalism of the hippies, and how this is a polite way of saying poverty. The generation that grew up on so much counterculture has now thrown that lifestyle away, becoming the consumerist stereotypes they criticized other people for being. And far from mimicking the behavior of their parents, Daria and her generation have rejected it altogether, the good and the bad. They acknowledge that nobody under 30 really believes in anything anymore, that despite their eccentricities, their parents at least had some sort of sense of justice instead of an indifference to the goings-on of the world. Even if the past did a lot of things wrong, they did a lot of things right, and it may not be a net gain to dispose of absolutely everything associated with their parents. Monster. After running into Mr. O'Neill at an art house film screening, Daria accidentally suggests the creation of a movie as a school project, and he makes it into one. Jody, Mac, Brittany, and Kevin try to film a documentary of a grocery store strike, but their camera's broken by a fight Kevin started when he tried to cross a picket line, and O'Neill thinks that it's symbolism. Jake wants to get the family to watch old childhood movies of his, only to become obsessed with rewatching a scene of him falling off his bike with nobody to help him up. Daria and Jane get the idea to make a mockumentary making fun of Quinn's shallowness, getting some footage of her getting angry about her pores, and then they plan on creating something to reveal how cruel she can be. But a combination of a lecture from Helen and Daria's conscience get the better of her, and she re-edits the film to be less damning of her sister, ultimately making Quinn even more popular than before. Daria's movie in this episode is planned to be a savage attack on the shallow and self-centered personality of her younger sister and the like-minded simpletons that she spends her time around. To show off how petty and cruel she can be to those around her is meant to be a denouncement of everything she stands for, and yet, Daria cannot bring herself to actually go through with this original plan as she starts to realize that attacking somebody for being petty is a very petty thing to do, and how can you criticize someone if you're no better? The resulting movie has a repeated use of Quinn joking about how she has no good side because they're both equal, and Daria uses this to show how Quinn, and anyone else who appears shallow, really does have two sides to their story. It's not that Quinn doesn't have any depth, she just relates superficially to everybody around her, so if she were to suddenly start talking about high-concept topics to the fashion club, she'd be talking to an audience that wouldn't relate. Thus, if Quinn lacks any depth, then she has to lack depth on both ends, both the cruelty and surface-level kindness. This is all to say that Quinn is not a shallow and hedonistic individual, but the logical result of a society that praises individuals for being shallow and hedonistic. She's a symptom, not the problem, and tearing down a person who's ostensibly a victim of societal norms isn't constructive or useful. The New Kid. Daria joins the yearbook to get a bribe from her parents, only to wind up receiving compliments from a new kid named Ted, who seems equal parts sheltered and intelligent. He gets the idea to take some pages away from sports and clubs to focus on student outreach instead, and Daria is blamed for the idea, earning her the annoyance of the school's jocks. But Daria's too interested in studying Ted as she finds his lack of real-world experience fascinating, even after his parents get upset with the Morgendorfers for exposing him to chewing gum. After trying to reject his friendship, she feels bad and takes him on a date to the arcade, where some guys Quinn tried to use to convince Daria to give up on her yearbook idea see Ted and hope to fight him in VR, though they have too much fun in the video game and Daria abandons him to his new popularity. In the end, Mr. DiMartino is assaulted by Miss Barch for not including the science club, and everything goes back to normal. Ted is introduced as somewhat of an anti-Daria. Whereas Daria herself is sardonic and antisocial, Ted is genuine and eager to talk to people. Daria always tries to find the worst in the world, and Ted always looks on the bright side of things, even laughing off some of Daria's insults. When Daria tries to find the worst side of him, she realizes that he has no bad side, and that he really is who he says he is. He doesn't quote old artists to come across as smart, he really is smart. He doesn't compliment people so he can ask them for a favor, he compliments people because he likes their work. Ted ends up clashing with the rest of the student body due to his desire to see student activism more heavily rewarded in the yearbook as a direct assault on their accomplishments made in the interest of appearing in the yearbook, something they assume is a petty way of getting to them instead of a real appreciation for charity. But once the rest of the school realizes the same thing Daria has, that he's not petty or manipulative, he quickly becomes everything that Daria is not only spiritually, but socially as well. Gifted. Grove Hills, an exclusive private school, sends an invitation to Daria and Jody to tour the campus for a while. As siblings aren't allowed at the showing, Quinn has to stay home, but being too afraid to leave her by herself, she instead is left with each member of the fashion club in succession before arguments lead her to Jane's house as a last resort. Meanwhile, Daria and Jody try to fit in on their tour, where they find that the kids of Grove Hills are similar in their disdain for the less intelligent around them. But this disdain extends too far out, and they mostly argue about whether they themselves fit in. Eventually, Jody snaps at the group, calling them out for their elitist behavior despite lacking self-awareness. She laments to Daria that she acted antisocially, and the two have a disagreement over whether that's positive or not. While this is happening, their parents have a few conversations where the Morgendorfers overcompensate while trying to appear unprejudiced, and come across worse as a result. The Grove Hill students are haughty, conceited, and they look down on everyone who's not a part of their social club, one in which you gain admission by being better than other people. The other kids at Lawndale are haughty, conceited, and they look down on anybody who isn't a part of their social club, one in which you gain admission by buying better things than other people. Daria is haughty, conceited, and she looks down on everyone who isn't just like her. The biggest issue the Grove Hill private school students have isn't that they're too good for society, but that they act like they are. And so Daria has to contend with the idea that she's finally found a place where she belongs, and that she hates every minute of it. But what she also has to contend with is the idea that being able to have everything you want is still a very unique position. That she's privileged for even being able to look down on other people in the first place without having to concern herself with whether that's going to cause problems for her in the long run. A similar character without this luck is Jody, and she even says as much. It doesn't matter how many clubs she joins, it doesn't matter how good her grades are, it doesn't matter how she treats people. She's always going to be the black girl. So her attitude winds up reflecting on her race, being one of the few representatives of it in as homogeneous a community as Lawndale, and she doesn't get the luxury of snapping at other students. Because if Daria is mean to somebody, they think that Daria is a mean person. If Jody is mean to somebody, they think that blacks are mean people. Ill. While at a Mystic Spiral concert, Daria gets the chance to have dinner with Jane and Trent, only to find herself breaking out in a red rash. She has Brittany cover for her as she leaves in exchange for not mentioning that she was at a club with someone other than Kevin, though the next morning Jane asks her about her whereabouts and doesn't get an answer. But when she breaks out again at school, Daria heads to the nurse's office and Jake, panicking over drug use from a new special, rushes over to check her into a real doctor's office. While there, they're unable to find anything wrong with her medically. Her friends come over to visit after Brittany fails to keep her brain fever a secret, and after a few nights is discharged with the assumption that the rash was merely caused by stress. Then, when Daria hears about Trent again, the rash returns. Daria's rash in this episode is all but stated to be psychosomatic, that is, it's all in her head. But just because something's in your head doesn't mean it's not real. After all, stress can cause hair loss, heart problems, the same thing that any emotion can, like a crush making your breathing erratic despite, again, being all in your head. What doesn't help is when this stress is ignored or misunderstood by the people around you. When Daria says that she was diagnosed with anxiety, Jake responds by questioning what she could possibly be anxious about, the obvious implication being that a lack of people to rely on in case something more serious happens is a stressor in and of itself. Daria feels stressed about the stress that she feels because of her stress. But it's not as though this is even true. Daria's first reaction to her breakout is to attempt to cover it up from those she cares about, hiding from Jane and Trent and asking Brittany to keep it a secret. But despite how secretive she was about it, every single person who found out about it kept a level head. Even Quinn's first reaction was to go through her skincare purse to find something that might help her sister out. So by the end of the episode, when the hospital room fills with almost every single person Daria knows, she starts to see that none of them are making fun of her or implying anything about where she could have gotten it from. They're simply relieved she's not dying of brain fever and then treating her like normal. It's telling, too, that her rash only comes back at the end of the episode when the last person close to her who hasn't seen it is called upon, once again showing the way in which her biggest fear is the fear of fear. Fair enough. When the library's roof caves in due to mismanaging the school's budget, Miss Lee puts a Renaissance fair on as a fundraiser, and mandates that students either volunteer or buy a ticket. Quinn volunteers to audition for the leading role in the Canterbury Tales, and winds up getting the role opposite Kevin, much to the annoyance of Brittany, who retaliates by kidnapping her boyfriend and causing him to miss the play. It also annoys the rest of the fashion club, with Sandy psyching her out by pointing out her inflection in reading. Between a last-minute substitute by one of the J guys, who gets his lines from the wrong chapter, and Jake trying to defend his daughter, the dinner theater turns into a food fight that Jody tries to put out, leaving Daria and Jane in charge of the information booth, where they tell an alternative version of medieval legends as retaliation against the fair for trapping them on a Ferris wheel with the sobbing Stacy. The main mode of thought in this episode goes something along the lines of, if I can't have it, nobody can. The girls of the fashion club are not interested in the play until Quinn shows interest, and then they all plan on auditioning. If they can't be uninterested in the play, then nobody can. And once no one else makes the role, they rededicate their jealousy to ensure that Quinn's fun is sabotaged. The three J's all want to play opposite her, but only one gets the chance, so the others mess with his line because if they can't have the honor, nobody can. And Daria and Jane are miserable having to listen to Stacy cry about her breakup, so they take out their frustrations by traumatizing a bunch of kids. That way, nobody gets to have a good time. But this is the natural end result of putting a bunch of teenagers into a situation they don't want to be in the first place. If they can't be engaged with on their own level, they'll drag a situation down to it so their terms are met. This is a bit of a stretch to mention, to speak in such vague terms. This episode is more of an anthology, following so many different characters that there's no time to follow a specific plot for long enough to include a degree of depth. See Jane run. After getting in trouble for not participating in a thinly veiled cheerleading practice during gym, and because of a guy named Evan, Jane decides to sign up for the track team, leaving Daria alone after school each day. Seeing that Daria is now talking to herself, Helen convinces Quinn to take her sister out to be more social, though Quinn is too concerned with her uncomfortable new high heels to really pay attention to her. Eventually, Daria goes to a track meet where Jane wins first place, immediately becoming popular as she's now a jock, while Daria insults her for selling out. After Daria shames her again for taking a bye on a math test due to her spot on the team, the two have another conversation, where Daria attempts to apologize for being jealous, while Jane confesses that she quit, avoiding blackmail to sign up again by threatening to tell news stations about the grade-fixing scheme. In the end, Daria and Jane both wind up having to do the faux cheerleading practice anyway, while lamenting that they were unable to change the system from the inside. Daria and Jane have together decided to scorn the rest of the world in favor of their shared sense of cynicism, and it's lucky that the two happen to have a similar outlook on the world, or else they'd be pointlessly rejecting society into a vacuum, with nobody around to talk to but themselves. Laughing at the absurdity of the world without at least one other person by your side to laugh with makes your behavior come across as jealous, that people have something you don't and you resent them for it. Without Jane, the story of Daria is actually a very sad story of a girl failing to fit in with anybody and blaming everyone but herself. It only takes one social connection to justify this behavior as asocial instead of antisocial. But part of what makes Daria especially upset during this episode is not just the fact that she's missing out on time with the friend, but the fact that her reaction to missing this time was so extreme. Helen tries to force Quinn to spend time with her, but they don't get along at all. Trent shows up at a track meet, but Daria doesn't relate to his beliefs on Jane running. She has nobody else and can't find anybody else, and it's an inevitability that at some point in the future, Jane will find new friends or go off to college or leave Daria for some other, totally justifiable reason. And when that happens, Daria has no backup plan. Pierce me. Jane's birthday is coming up, and Trent wants to get her something that isn't just art supplies. So he takes Daria out shopping, only to come across a piercing salon where she gets convinced to get her navel pierced as part of a special. Daria shows off the piercing to a few girls at school, only to feel ashamed that she got a piercing because of some guy. Daria ends up removing the piercing due to itchiness, and it heals overnight, with Trent finding out and saying it happened before he dedicates a song to his little sister, while Daria gets her the art supplies she really wanted. Meanwhile, Quinn is complaining about a mother-daughter fashion show that she doesn't want the school to host, until learning that Sandy and her mother are participating. So Quinn tries to train her mom to be more fashionable before the day of the show, only to be humiliated when the two trip on the runway. The one thing Daria would never do is to change herself due to trying to impress another person. In this episode, she changes herself to try to impress another person. So much of her self-image has to do with her obstinacy to the trends that so many others are peer-pressured into. She's better than a mindless trend chaser, or so she tells herself. All it takes is a guy she has a crush on to suggest getting a belly button piercing, and then she does it. This means that she wasn't quite so opposed to trend chasing as she believed herself to be. It was a matter of disliking other people and the things they did that defined her confidence. The second one of those things was gone, she became a hypocrite. But just because you let other people influence your life doesn't necessarily mean that you're any worse of a person for doing so. Helen spent this episode going along with Quinn's increasingly obsessive ideas for the fashion show, wearing clothes she never would wear, and getting her hair redone and objectifying herself on a stage, not because she wants to, and not solely because she's trying to one-up another mom, but because Helen wants Quinn to be happy. Helen doesn't act like herself during this episode, but we don't think of her as a bad person because of this. We think of her as a selfless and considerate mother. And so Daria should be able to find some satisfaction in the idea that she's merely allowing another person to expand her horizons and convinces her to try some things even though she doesn't stick to them. It's not weakness, but trust. Right where it hurts. Mr. O'Neill has the class write an assignment on the moral importance of various fictional works. But as Daria has already read all the books available, he gives her the unique assignment of writing something original with real people she knows. Daria tries and fails to do this, only managing to create parodies of The Graduate, Pride and Prejudice, and Macbeth. Helen sees her struggling and tries to help, but Daria tells her off for trying to compare her to Quinn. But later, when she can't find help from anyone else, she turns back to her mother, who tells her that the sarcastic attitude has made her detached enough from reality that not even Daria knows what she really wants anymore. In the end, Daria writes about her ideal version of the future, where she's a successful columnist while Quinn is the mother of four, proving to Helen that she's not so detached after all, and she tells Jane about the way she made her mother cry. Daria is a very opinionated person, having some sort of quip for every situation she finds herself in, and overall being a very judgmental person. But all of these opinions amount to very little if they're all negative. She judges other people for their actions and their beliefs, while she herself hides her own beliefs, and does very little, to avoid the same kind of scrutiny she places onto other people from being placed onto her. She insults other people for their beliefs, but never lets her own beliefs be known at the risk of those beliefs being insulted as well. But during this episode, she starts to realize the real reason she resorts to this coping mechanism. It's not so much that she's afraid of opening up to other people, but the idea that if she ever does open up, she'll show them absolutely nothing. What if Daria is not a deep person? What if Daria is just as shallow as the people she looks down upon? Not liking stuff isn't really a personality, it's just a way of hiding the fact that you're afraid of yourself. At least the people she's making fun of so often believe in stuff. Even shallow things like fashion and pop culture and fitting in are more valuable to believe in than nothing. So Daria forces herself to open up and writes a story in which she's no longer keeping her opinions to herself, but sharing them with the world. And her sister has stopped being so self-absorbed and become a caring person, where her father has learned to get over his issues, and her mother's more open with her children. Daria does believe in something after all, that as miserable as she acts now, she's hoping things will one day be better. Season 3. Behind the scenes, nothing major changed between seasons 2 and 3 in the same way we saw a change between 1 and 2. By now, characterization is more set in stone, and the overall style has been established in too thorough a way as to change it to better suit a specific audience. But that isn't to say that this next season is a mere spiritual follow-up to the earlier one. In fact, Season 3 starts to take on a much different approach to Daria as a character than before. Where she was once the type of person to look down on the rest of the world, now the show makes more active strides to show that she isn't so different after all, and in doing so, her very identity starts to be called into question. Daria's dark and sardonic attitude has never won her many friends, and moving forward the narrative is more interested in exploring this. Is her personality justified? Is this really a good way to live your life? Daria was once relatable for rolling her eyes at the mundanity of the world, but now she's becoming relatable for the world rolling its eyes back at her. Daria, the musical. A musical episode where most of the conversations and plot developments are put to song. Jake wakes up and announces his pleasure at another day in the burbs, with his family joining in on the chorus, except for the barely lucid Daria. She then attends school in spite of a hurricane warning, where Daria joins Jane on the roof of the school to avoid a pep rally that's co-opted by Kevin's excitement. But when the principal announces the arrival of the hurricane, she tells everybody to leave the school, as she doesn't want anybody dying on campus. But Kevin doesn't believe in the hurricane and joins Brittany on the roof of the school, accidentally trapping the two up there with Daria and Jane. Back in Lawndale, Jody and Max sing about how things might be better if the whole town blows away, something Daria and Jane agree with, while Quinn sings about the way she has to be the best at fashion, and so she can't leave them all early, while Helen mirrors her song, saying that she has to be the hardest working woman at the office. Eventually, Jake arrives home to find that Daria is missing, and after calling over Trent, the two decide to be manly and rush out to rescue the girls, only to crash the car instead. Back on the roof, Daria, Jane, and Brittany encourage Kevin to be manly and break down the door, which he does to the revelation that the storm is over and the town didn't blow away. In the end, everyone sings about the way that they're more or less grateful to see tomorrow, to see another day in the burbs. Brewalind darkly. After a driving lesson, Helen suggests that Daria get contacts to help with her peripheral vision, though Daria recognizes this as another attempt to make her more normal and rejects the offer. Though she still considers it, even turning to Quinn for fashion advice before running away from her vanity. After a call to her Aunt Amy, Daria eventually decides to start to wear contacts, getting a few compliments before she decides to remove them because they're itchy. She spends the rest of the day bumping into people, and then continues to not wear her glasses the day after, as she likes the way she looks, but dislikes the discomfort. But after seeing Kevin wearing fake glasses and admitting to Jane that she's become vain enough to care about her appearance, Daria locks herself in a bathroom stall before Brittany is able to point out how similar they are, and Daria finally comes out, realizing there's nothing inhuman about caring about your looks. Daria's at first against wearing contacts due to the fact that her glasses are a part of her identity, except that identity is one built around the idea of not caring too much about her own identity. It's a fashion statement that says she doesn't care what her fashion statement says. So when she gets the opportunity to make the switch, she starts to really ponder why not to make it and realizes the irony of that way of thinking. She tries hard to make it look like she's not trying hard, and she cares about whether or not people think she cares. So the root of her issue is that she's shallow without realizing it, putting pride in her personal appearance despite normally looking down on the people who do this. This becomes complicated when Daria actually stops wearing her glasses, because now she's forced to make the same leap of logic to switch back. If she doesn't care about how she comes across, then wearing contacts one day and switching back means that she was self-conscious about the way her glasses, and lack thereof, made her look. Thus, she experimented and cared about how the experiment turned out. And what's more embarrassing than announcing you don't care only to be outed as a hypocrite? The Old and the Beautiful. Miss Lee has Lawndale High participate in a mandatory volunteering campaign. Quinn and the Fashion Club do a clothing drive for the homeless, but fail to find anything up to their standards, going door to door, and ultimately come up with very little but makeovers for themselves. Jane volunteers for an art class at a children's hospital, but gets banned after including an authentic scalping in a western scene. Daria reads to the elderly at a retirement home alongside the much more popular Kevin and Brittany, who are constantly requested by the retirees as they enjoy their voices much more. Hoping to get a bit more attention, Daria tries to mimic Quinn's mannerisms and even gets a lesson from Brittany, but she fails to improve and they end up having her read to a deaf woman. In the end, Lee gets the recognition she wanted, and Daria returns to the deaf woman to read whatever she wants to without judgment. Part of Daria's identity is that she considers herself to be better than other people, but part of the conflict she faces is that she struggles to define what better really means. Some things are clear. Being shallow and vapid is not good, and so being more conscious of your role in the world must be good. Caring a lot about physical things like appearance or the sound of one's voice is shallow and thus bad. But caring about a trait like a person's dedication to a charitable cause is good. So what happens when the people Daria looks down upon turn out to be better at reading to the elderly than she is? Worse, what happens when they're better at being charitable, specifically because of superficial traits of their personality? So Daria spends this episode trying to be more vapid and self-interested in order to come across as less vapid and self-interested. Normally, being unpopular doesn't bother her at all, as the people who make up the society that rejects her are people she doesn't really care about. She's actually glad not to fit in with those crowds. But to not fit in with a bunch of elderly folks who presumably have moved beyond that shallowness means that she's suddenly being judged unfit to spend time with people who it's okay to look up to. But this sort of insincerity isn't all bad, as she learns when their retirement home pairs her up with a deaf woman. This deaf woman can't hear her, but still talks as though she enjoys being read to, something that's clearly untrue, and yet it's a lie meant to be comforting, just like Daria putting on a fake personality to comfort the elderly in the first place. Depth takes a holiday. Daria is approached by the spirit of St. Patrick's Day and Valentine's Day, who lament that Christmas, Halloween, and Guy Fawkes Day have left Holiday Island to start an electronica band in Lawndale instead of performing their usual holiday responsibilities. She tracks down the sentient holidays with Trent's help, but after a conversation decides that it's not her role to tell them to go somewhere they don't want to go to. So St. Patrick's and Valentine's look for another person to do their bidding, only to realize Daria is the only one who can. She agrees, as she's now sick of the others crashing at her house, and goes to Holiday Island for inspiration, discovering an upcoming prom that their band can play at, as a gig is a gig. She brings them back, and they kick President's Day out of the social order, getting new gigs lined up for years. Back in Lawndale, Helen and Jake are infatuated with one another due to Cupid's doing, and Quinn believes they're trying for a baby that will take attention away from her. She tries to get between them to stop this from happening, but the spell wears off on its own and they go back to fighting each other. A very much non-canon episode that riffs on holiday episodes in other series by having Daria more or less opposed to the magical realism of the setting for that day. Rather than having Daria save Christmas from some kind of gremlin, the existential threat facing the holiday is trying to join a band and not being very successful, caught up in the commodification of an art form and eschewing their usual responsibilities to be young adult slackers. And instead of a big holiday that usually gets specials, they're working with Guy Fawkes Day and fighting against President's Day. There could be some takeaway from this episode regarding the way in which Christmas gets caught up in trying to be rich and famous and then fails to capture any sort of holiday spirit, but this is only very, very small subtext. Nothing the episode's writing dwells on in lieu of focusing on the more absurd aspects that themselves don't stick around long enough to say anything either. In a show known for being acerbic and down-to-earth, this episode draws on higher fantasy tropes and personified holidays with no holds barred about the fact that it's not realistic. It would be a perfectly average episode of any other show, but this is Daria, so it stands out as being just as trite as what the show usually parodies. Daria Dance Party. The school dance is coming up, and the administration is looking for somebody to volunteer for the planning committee. Sandy convinces Quinn to head the committee, as she doesn't want to plan a party herself, and then she plans a separate party on the same night to try to pull people away from the school's dance. Quinn and Sandy feud over who can get more people to come over, but when Sandy's party has no planning put into it, everybody leaves to go to the school dance instead. The school dance was largely organized by Jane, as Quinn didn't want to do any work, and Jane was looking for an excuse to paint on a large canvas, namely the gym wall. Quinn takes all the credit for the dance going well, then heads into the parking lot where Kevin is fighting another football player for going on a date with Brittany after they two temporarily broke up, despite Brittany intentionally finding a guy to date who would make Kevin jealous. Quinn convinces her guys to join in on the fight for her sake, and in the end, Brittany gets back together with Kevin after seeing his broken jaw. Daria and Jane sit on the sidelines of the party until two twins show up with a similar sense of humor to them. They chat for a while until realizing the twins are cousins of Upchucks, the dance's DJ, and they leave in time to see Sandy and the fashion club locked outside in the snow. Another light anthology episode consisting of a series of loosely connected plots that all happen around the same event. In spite of Daria's name appearing in the title, she has very little to do in this episode, similarly to every other set-piece episode thus far. Since these episodes are character-heavy and plot-light, there tends to be little to say about them in explicit terms, though these episode retrospectives wind up being a bit shorter due to only having the recap section. The closest connecting trend there is in this episode is the idea of jealousy and the way in which it hurts people's abilities to enjoy things they otherwise would. Sandy attempts to steal the thunder from Quinn by hosting her own party, and she could have had her wishes just fine if she didn't overpromise in the interest of trying to steal more and more. But because she promised things she had no intention of following through on from the start, Sandy winds up throwing a lame party when she could have thrown the same get-together with lower expectations and still gotten a gathering of friends that everyone enjoyed. Likewise, Brittany and Kevin spend the episode trying to find a date to make the other one jealous, and then even after Brittany's able to find someone unaware of the pact the football team made, she still spends the whole dance thinking of Kevin, because trying to get revenge on a person in this way is impossible if you're not obsessing over their opinion of you in the first place. The Lost Girls. Mr. O'Neill submits an essay Daria wrote to a fashion magazine, Val, where she's scouted for being edgy enough to win a competition to have Val, the head editor and namesake, spend a day with her. Val immediately gets on Daria's nerves with her fake corporate speak, made worse by everyone around her giving her constant attention. But Jane encourages her to keep going to try to convince Val to give her a trip to New York. The two then attend Lawndale, with Val supposedly going incognito, though she sticks out due to being in her 30s and the fact that she had her agents alert nearby news crews. Over the course of the day, Val keeps changing outfits to try to fit in with what she thinks the other students are doing, and as she does so, slowly comes to the conclusion that the girl she's following around isn't popular after all. Daria finally tells Val off, and she storms out, writing a hit piece on Student D for not appreciating her youth enough, while Daria is glad to finally be left alone again. Nothing that Val says during this episode is backed up by evidence, even within her own behavior. She'll mention not wanting to make a big deal over visiting a high school, and then invite paparazzi to harass her. She'll talk about the way in which she intends to lead the pack socially as people look up to her, and then changes twice throughout the day to fit in better. She acts like she has wisdom people turn to her for relationship advice, while she's being cheated on behind her back. And she talks about wanting to create counterculture, but she herself represents the mainstream culture that counterculture exists to fight. But then again, this is more or less all part of her plan from the beginning. Her magazine runs articles that are meant to inform their readers, but they can't do too good of a job in doing so, or else she risks having the readers leave them. If you run a business that preys on teenagers being insecure, then giving them a sense of emotional security will cause them to stop turning to you for advice. It's like a dating advice column giving bad dating advice so its readers don't stop reading. So the trends that a magazine like Val tells people to follow are, by design, extremely temporary things, because if they accidentally promote something consistently popular, then there would be no need for magazines to tell people what's popular, because everyone would still know. It happened one nut. Lawndale High gets the result for a career aptitude test back. Quinn gets neck model, while Daria has mortician. As Quinn wants $500 for a modeling portfolio, but her parents don't want to give her the money, they suggest that she get a job instead. Helen also asks Daria to choose between peer counseling and a job, and after finding out the peer counseling is run by a member of the fashion club, chooses the job instead, with Jake pulling strings to get her hired at a nut stand in the mall, where Quinn is working at a pet shop. Daria has to work alongside Kevin, wear a silly hat, and smile at every customer, something she hates doing. But after narrowly being seen by Trent working at the nut shack, Jane decides to help out by calling Helen and making up a story about sexist management that has Helen pull Daria out of the store, just in time to see the three J-boys panicking over a loose boa constrictor, set loose by Quinn. Daria is practically defined by her lack of enthusiasm for everything, then gets a job that requires her to smile and memorize a spiel about nuts. She hates the job not for the people she has to work with, or the work itself, but the association of the work itself and the people she has to work with. If somebody sees her there, they'll assume that she has, at best, sold out her ideals, and at worst, that she has some strong conviction for nut stands. Though the people who know her the best would know that this is not indicative of her real personality at all, and that she's merely adopting a fake service industry personality as anyone would. As much as she is loath to admit it, Daria has a persona she has to maintain, and it's something harmed by this temporary career. So there's a question raised about why she doesn't simply quit and lie to her parents or attempt to get fired, and this is answered by the fact that the work itself is seen as beneath her, and not the other way around. Daria has a sense of pride. It's just not in her work, and so she has to somehow maintain the job while acting like she doesn't want it, something that her boss refuses to understand as a possibility, since he doesn't just demand Daria's time, but her energy as well. And at the end of the day, that's what usually takes more effort than any amount of physical labor. Les Miserables. Members of the Lane family all begin to visit Lawndale, staying in the family's house together and constantly arguing among themselves. Between Wind, a narcissist who turns every conversation around to be about his failed marriages, Penny, a wannabe revolutionary trying to save the third world, Summer, a negligent mother whose children run wild, and Amanda, whose hands-off parenting can't control any of them, Jane, and later Trent, end up staying with the Morgendorfer family rather than their own, to get a bit of peace. Helen and Jake accept this arrangement, using the time closer to Jane to ask her about Daria, who's been distant lately. But Daria is avoidant as she's nervous about having Trent living with her, until a date of his shows up and she starts to feel jealous, eventually taking advice from Quinn to imagine a better future where she pictures herself married to a couch-bound Trent, babying him as he still focuses on his band, before finally getting over the crush, mostly. Eventually, Amanda asks Helen for advice on how to get her family out of the house, and Helen suggests hosting a family dinner. This finally makes them all talk for long enough to get sick of each other, and things return to normal. The Lanes and the Morgendorfers have their parenting styles compared during this episode, a microcosm of the mentality of hands-on parenting versus hands-off. Neither one is shown to be inherently better, as the Lane family is much closer, with people feeling welcome in their home and free to express themselves no matter how annoying they can be. While at the Morgendorfer household, the kids are so reserved that Jake doesn't even know how old his daughters are, and Helen is desperate to try to learn even basic things about them. But at the same time, the Morgendorfers seem to have the nicer household, with the Lanes taking refuge with Daria when things get too out of hand. Amanda mentions how Trent once spent 6 months living in a tent in the yard, and how she let him do this so as not to come across as overbearing. Yet when Trent mentions this story, he says he waited the entire time for some sign that his family wanted him back. Ultimately, the children of both families crave what they don't have. Daria and Quinn roll their eyes at the overbearing parenting styles of Helen and Jake, wishing they could get some time alone while they have a bit of privacy. But the Lane children have exactly what Daria wants, and they resent that. Trent is desperate for just a little bit of attention from an authority figure, and Jane has had to take care of herself for her whole life. And while she's managed to come out more or less okay, she still has almost zero respect for her own parents, not exactly an enviable position. Jake of Hearts. Jake has a mild heart attack, and the rest of the family wonders what they can do to help him out, with Quinn deciding to become a heart doctor and Helen doing more around the house. But Jake wants his mother to come over, and shortly afterwards Ruth arrives. Ruth starts to baby Jake while admonishing Helen for everything she does, eventually sitting down to talk to Jake about how bad his childhood was when he points out how neglectful Mad Dog Morgendorfer could be. She ultimately agrees with him, and Daria is then able to point out Ruth's own words in stating that she would do a lot of things differently in raising her kids when she tries to groom Quinn and Helen to be more like her. Eventually, Daria talks to her father about how he's doing a better job than his dad, because his dad was dead by that age, and Jake makes a full recovery. While this is happening, 2 annoying local DJs, Bing and the Spatula Man, set up at Lawndale to host their show, Mental in the Morning. After trying to harass Daria into talking on the air, she eventually caves and speaks a bit about how her father was hospitalized, causing the radio show to shut down. Jake's mother grew up under a different type of American culture, one where the idea of a woman dreaming big was unheard of. She tells Quinn not to have ambitions of being a doctor when she could simply marry a doctor instead, and that she should be preparing for a role as a housewife. She admonishes Helen for not being able to cook or for having a poor eye for interior decoration. She also fails to find something to compliment Daria on, in spite of her granddaughter being one of the smartest kids in her school. And yet, for all these mistakes she points out, Ruth also acknowledges that she was married to an abusive man and had practically no freedom around the house. Resenting the past, she tries to force onto the woman of the family. To have no say in your future and then to act like things turned out the way you wanted is generally the sign of a person who's very resigned to fate. And even people in the present can look back and consider themselves failures for not living up to the idea that was done away with for good reasons. It's only comparing what you have, instead of what you don't, that you can finally compare yourself to past generations. It's something Jake finally internalizes, albeit in a very shallow way, by the end of the episode. Helen might not be a good housewife, but she's a good person, and that's something she values more than her domestic abilities. Daria might not make a good housewife again one day, but she doesn't care. She values herself for things other than cooking ability. Even Quinn, as shallow as she is, has higher ambitions than marrying rich and then staying home all day. Speedtrapped. Mystic Spiral is going on their world tour, a trip to a rural town 100 miles away, and they have Jane drive them down there while Daria house-sits Quinn. But when Jane calls from prison saying she was pulled over for reckless driving, she asks Daria to bring them money to pay off the speeding ticket so they can be released. Daria, who just got her license, prepares to drive down there, but Quinn insists on going along, and the two bicker over Daria's timid driving style. Eventually, Quinn pulls over to pick up a hitchhiker who serenades them with Conway Twitty covers before being dropped off. The two girls then arrive at the jailhouse, only for Quinn to have spent their ticket money on a new outfit. So they go back to the bar where they dropped off the cowboy, and Quinn swindles them with a made-up story to get the bail money. But ultimately this winds up being pointless, as Mystic Spiral and Jane have been paying off their debt to society by playing the sheriff's daughter's party. This episode draws a comparison between the lifestyle of Daria and the lifestyle of Quinn, one girl who lives far too conservatively and risk-averse, while the other is reckless and often gets into trouble. But when they arrive at the jailhouse and have no money, it's Quinn's plan that ultimately saves them, raising the money to bail out the rest from jail to save the day. This is seen as a sort of justification for her behavior, though Daria still recognizes that it was Quinn who got them into the situation in the first place, and you can't act as though you're a savior when all you've done is clean up your own mess. But what also lines up with Quinn's behavior is the overall inciting incident. Daria didn't want to go along on the band's trip in the first place due to reservations about the length and location. She uses house-sitting as an excuse, despite never being one who adhered strictly to rules in the first place. So had everybody acted Daria's way from the outset, nobody would have had their little adventure in the first place. And these are shown to be a net positive, with Jane being able to draw an artist's interpretation of various paintings and Mystic Spiral ultimately getting to have their concert after all, while also meeting a man who made so much rock history. If you believe his stories, that is. The Lawndale File. After some government agents arrive at Lawndale High for a vague speech about enemies, and Daria watches a tell-all about aliens, she starts to suspect the weird behavior of those around her, such as Quinn wearing a weird outfit and touching her neck, the football team worrying about a threat to their practice, and a rumor starting about Daria and Jane being communists, due to a misunderstanding of O'Neill's discussion on old-school sci-fi. When Mr. DiMartino is dragged out of school in handcuffs, Daria starts to suspect that aliens are taking over, and she heads to Jane's to investigate, where they hear Trent recording a happy song while a pizza delivery boy rants about synthetic skin. Ultimately, these are all revealed to have mundane explanations. Quinn had a neck zit she was covering, Kevin thought a before-school assembly was trying to shut down sports, O'Neill was trying to make people stop reliving anti-communist paranoia, and Trent was merely writing a jingle for a car commercial. In the end, Daria is able to clear up all the confusion, and they watch a Sick Sad World special interviewing the pizza guy. Daria gets caught up in a cycle of paranoia during this episode, affecting her ability to think clearly as she prepares to see the worst-case scenario wherever she goes. Ordinarily, any one of these plots would have been explained logically by her, assuming she would pay attention to them at all. But when lumped together, she's prepared to take the less logical standalone solution again and again, until ultimately Daria winds up extremely paranoid regarding the safety of Lawndale from a threat she doesn't even understand in terms other than fear of the unknown. It doesn't help that Daria is buying into this fear largely because of the fact that everyone else is buying into it as well. This is what happens when you let other people do your thinking for you. You wind up getting opinions from people who are also letting others do the thinking for them, until ultimately the entire conspiracy winds up being started by a failed delivery boy who thinks that aliens stole his skin. Instead of Daria trying to think of a solution, she ought to have tried to know a solution, figure out what facts she has first, and then base everything else off of an Occam's razor, that is, taking the most likely conclusion every time, instead of making a theory first and then looking exclusively at the evidence that supports what she already believes. Just add water. Lawndale is having a casino night on a yacht that Miss Lee makes mandatory. Daria and Jane don't want to go as there's a TV marathon the night before they plan on staying up to watch, but when they're dragged along anyway, they spend the night looking for a place to sleep. Quinn argues with Sandy over whose date asked who first before Quinn meets a model at the hair salon and he asks her out, though this model winds up not showing to the event, and she turns to Daria for advice on how to stop people from discussing the fact that she was stood up, with Daria saying to simply pretend it doesn't bother her until they lose interest. Mr. DiMartino struggles with a gambling addiction, ultimately getting dragged into a game of poker and soon after trying to sell his watch to anyone who will buy it. Jake tries to sweet-talk the ship's owner to get a consulting gig, but Helen leaves to gamble instead, with Jake winding up cornered by the owner's wife, who later tries to get between Mr. O'Neill and Miss Barch. Eventually, the captain drunkenly leaves his post and the yacht collides with a garbage barge, with everyone winding up in waist-high water, except for Brittany and Kevin who fell overboard on the lifeboat earlier. Another anthology-light episode that focuses very little on a single overarching plot to instead give each character a little bit to do with their storylines, all converging around Daria, who's mostly interested in taking a nap. Each character here is stuck on a boat, with some desire that they want out of the night that ends up being unachieved due to somebody else's conflicting wishes. In some cases, these were predictable, in others, not reacted to. Jake is upset he's not taken seriously enough by his wife, so he tries to woo the owner of the boat in order to get a shot at a consulting gig. Ignoring how unlikely this was to work in the first place, he winds up not having the support of Helen, and then blames her for this, despite Helen's disinterest being predictable. The fashion club has an argument over whose date is more popular, and who was whose backup plan. Of course, in focusing so hard on one-upping each other, they would neglect the more realistic outcomes of Sandy being stood up and a random model not showing up, though ironically enough, his story about getting lost ended up being true. The only people who got what they wanted were Brittany and Kevin, who just wanted somewhere to be alone and ended up stranded on a dinghy, and more ironically, wound up better off than the people on the sinking ship. Jane's addiction. Mr. O'Neill assigns a multimedia project to his students, and Jane offers to work with Daria as her grades are low and she doesn't want to repeat language arts. Jane offers to ask Trent to work on the musical portion of the project, and they head to a Mystic Spiral concert to ask him, though Jane meets a man named Tom at the concert and she leaves with him, leaving Daria alone with Trent, who agrees to do the project. But Daria resents being left alone and, despite getting a ride home from Trent, spends the next day upset with Jane for spending more and more time with Tom than with her. Worse, she keeps having to go over to visit with Jane as they're still doing the project together, and neither she nor Trent are doing their part. Tom eventually tries to get to know Daria better as he dislikes coming between them, and Daria's eventually able to get Jane to talk to her brother, but in the end, Trent fails to come through on his part, and Daria starts to lose interest in the guy before ultimately accepting Tom as Jane's new boyfriend. Daria's crush on Trent turns out to be just that, a crush and nothing more. She was originally attracted to the idea of him as a rebel, the kind of person who made his own rules and never let society's ideas of success define him. He was a rebel in the same sense that Daria saw herself as one, equally sharing in his disdain for boring and mundane behavior that's done because it's what everyone else is doing. But sometimes everybody does the same thing because it's the smart thing to do, and not every social convention needs to be defied out of principle. Trent doesn't believe in deadlines and struggles to motivate himself on many things, and as it turns out, punctuality is a social convention in the same way that basic decency is. Daria has already begun to suspect that Trent is less of a rebel and more of a deadbeat, and him letting her down on the school project is what confirmed this fact. But while Daria loses her crush on Trent in this episode, Jane gains a relationship with Tom, a guy who is able to connect to Jane's sensibilities in a way that Daria herself is unable to see. To her, Tom represents a loss of a relationship instead of a potential gain, that Jane is no longer spending time with her to spend time with Tom instead. Rather than trying to see what she sees in him and realizing that they can't be too different to both relate to Jane in the first place, she lets her first impressions of what the guy represents taint her impression of him instead of trying to learn about Tom for who he is. And this is the exact type of judgment Daria has resented in others for so many years. Season 4. Season 4 saw a few changes in the original concept of the show, with Daria switching from something that looked down on teen drama to a show that engaged with it. Relationships, breakups, spats between lovers and friends alike. It still very much looked down upon these sorts of relationships and the people who obsessed over them, but it did so from a helpless position in the middle of it all. We can't help but engage in drama because emotional connections to other people are inherently dramatic. So to avoid drama means avoiding people, and that's not a great way to live one's life. Aside from that, a few other changes were made. Lines and character designs became much thicker, and we saw more shots done in motion instead of still backgrounds. As much as some of the characters are getting developed, so too is the setting of Lawndale. Partner's Complaint. Daria is tired of Jane blowing her off to spend time with Tom instead, and this escalates into an argument between the two where Daria decides to work on a project with Jody instead of Jane, with Jane winding up with Brittany after she has an argument with Kevin, who's working with Mac. This project is about real-world economic experience, pretending to take on an economic commitment and returning with their findings. Daria and Jody attempt to take out a small business loan, but the first bank's owner doesn't approve of Jody's business plan until he finds out her father's name, something Jody uses at the next bank to immediately get their loan. Daria calls her a hypocrite for doing this, but ultimately comes around and agrees that her approach was pragmatic. Meanwhile, Brittany gets a car cheaply by flirting with the salesman, while Kevin mistakenly buys a car for real, returning it shortly afterwards at a loss. Daria winds up applying what she learned about Jody to Jane, and ends up finding out Jane forgives her for acting out, and everything goes back to normal. Daria's principles coming into conflict with the world is effectively the entire plot of this show, but this is the episode where the world really starts to fight back against that idea. That just because you have principles, you're not better than anyone else, as those principles are only as strong as the end result of them. Jody is at first angry that a bank manager would pass over her for a loan and ask Daria for her credentials instead, claiming that he may have been prejudiced against the color of her skin and that her father's name shouldn't have to carry her through life. And then the next chance she gets, she waves her family name around in order to prevent being discriminated against in the first place. Daria calls her a hypocrite for this, and Jody admits that she might have a point, assuming that Jody was a purely principled person in the first place. If a principle's end goal results in being passed over for opportunities, then you'll be a principled failure, so it's best to be flexible with your life. Be prepared to ignore your beliefs if those beliefs are majorly inconveniencing you. It doesn't make you a hypocrite to adapt. This whole experience ends up teaching Daria this lesson in a way that allows it to apply to her other relationships. She's critical of Jane for spending time without her, in spite of the two girls supposedly being friends, and her reaction is to cut the friendship off, leaving her with no one else. It's principled to be lonely and miserable, but it's pragmatic to be sociable and nice to the people you care about. Because what's the point of pride if you have nothing to be proud about? Antisocial Climbers. Helen and Jake go on a couple's retreat to a cabin, while Lawndale High has a field trip to a snowy mountain nearby. Miss Lee uses it as an opportunity to have the whole thing filmed by Mr. O'Neill, though after he collapses from his inhaler running out and Miss Barch drags him along, he eventually escapes into a cave where he starts to record a video will before Miss Lee finds him because she wanted to rescue the camera. Quinn packs several bags of accessories that the J-Boys carry instead of the school survival equipment, and when a blizzard blows in, they start to turn on Quinn as they blame her for their hunger and cold. So Mr. DiMartino sets out to find help, with Daria and Jane volunteering to go along with him to avoid their peers. DiMartino quickly falls off a cliff, stumbling into Helen and Jake's cabin, where they invite him to play charades so they don't have to talk to each other. Meanwhile, Daria and Jane make a few lame death confessions to one another before the storm lets up and everyone's able to make it home, except for Kevin, who's left behind after an argument with Brittany over some bees hiding in the flowers he picked for her. This episode plays out like a disaster movie, and like most disaster movies, the antagonist is rarely the weather event itself, but people's reactions to it. The blizzard would not have been a problem if everyone stuck to the principles of common sense. They brought plenty of supplies, traveled in pairs, they let people know where they were going, and then began to ignore all of these life-saving boons to follow their ambitions anyway. Quinn cared less about the lesson and more about accessorizing, and brought several bags of useless equipment that weighed down a group of boys who cared more about impressing her than helping the trip. DiMartino knew it was smart to travel with people, but insisted on leading the pack as he's unable to put a bit of trust in those behind him, and then falls off a cliff instead. Helen and Jake know they should be using the camping trip as an opportunity to work on the parts of their relationship that aren't working, but get caught up in revisiting their sex lives instead, because that's all they really know about each other. Even Daria and Jane were smart enough to recognize it's a good idea to stay with people they know, but chose to brave the weather instead, as they found it better to freeze with a friend than stay warm with people you can't stand. A tree grows in Lawndale. Daria and Jane encourage Kevin to get a motorcycle to go with his new jacket, and he actually buys one, riding it recklessly at the behest of the other students before crashing into the Tommy Sherman memorial tree. This causes him to break his knee, making it impossible to play football anymore and threatening his relationship with Brittany because he's no longer a football player. It also threatens the town's standing in general, as Lawndale starts losing games and getting a worse reputation, with the fashion club getting undesirable fitting rooms and Jake becoming concerned with property value. Daria gets the idea from Tom to have the depressed Kevin become a motivational speaker for elementary students, and this turns his life around as he finds value in being a warning to others, eventually regaining his confidence enough to rejoin the football team, where hopefully all his future injuries will only be to his head. This episode shows the harm that you make yourself vulnerable to when all of your self-worth is derived from a single source, especially when that source is something you don't have a lot of control over. When Kevin hurts his knee and can't play football anymore, he also loses his sense of identity, because playing football was all he had. Nobody respected him for any reason other than his ability to throw the football, so when that was lost, he lost everything else. His girlfriend, his friends, and status. But the rest of the town had their reputations tied to the football team as well, judging themselves by the accomplishments of other people. So after they lost a few games, they also lost their self-respect. And worse than losing self-respect because of your own actions is losing self-respect because of someone else's. Because when this happens, you don't have the agency to get it back. But Kevin is ultimately, with the help from someone smarter, able to find another reason to feel self-satisfaction. He gets the positive attention of children that he gives safety lessons to, and gets back his mojo, so to speak. He then has the confidence to win back other people's confidence, not because he's good at something, but because he's self-assured enough to find something to be good at. So everyone gets a happy ending, although it's still best not to think too hard about the fact that guys like Kevin are the backbone of an entire community. Murder She Snored. The entire football team gets a 100 on a test, and Mr. DiMartino, assuming they cheated, threatens to fail the entire class if the party guilty of stealing the answers does not come forward. That night, Daria falls asleep with the TV on and has a pop culture-infused dream where Kevin is murdered, stuffed into Daria's locker, and then she gets blamed for his death. After a failed attempt at a good cop, bad cop routine, She then turns to the fashion club to investigate, only for them to lose interest when the death is no longer trendy. After Kevin's funeral, where people struggle to say something nice about him, Daria is about to be led to the electric chair by her father, who became a detective after quitting his consultant job. But she claims innocence, and gets the real killers to oust themselves as everyone there. It turns out that everybody killed Kevin at the same time except for Daria, but they send her to her death anyway because Miss Lee already ordered a chair. Daria then wakes up, tells Jane about the dream, and Mr. DiMartino announces that he's not failing anyone after all, only for Kevin to walk in pretending to have been killed before the teacher tries to strangle him for real. Justice in society is often based more around how people feel about another person rather than the actual facts behind a case. Outside of the legal system, people have a tendency to make snap judgments about public figures based on the reactions of other people to those snap judgments. And then death threats and doxing attempts begin to fly in response to a rude statement by a person, as people often inflate the values of their feelings in the moment to be greater than whatever actual harm was done. Daria doesn't get accused of murder because there's evidence that supports the accusation, but because she doesn't fit in with everyone else, with everybody else ironically being the real killers. At least, this is the truth as Daria sees the world. She views herself as a victim of circumstance in that she's constantly criticized for things she has little control over, or an accusation is made about her sabotaging the school yearbook, with nobody bothering to ask her about the validity of those statements. And while there's a lot of merit to these feelings, after all, the rest of the school is a very judgmental group, Daria herself rarely does anything to try to dispel these rumors. Part of this is due to the fact that she knows better than to try to talk sense into the senseless, but another part is her own lack of trying. The F word. After getting inspiration from a teaching seminar, Mr. O'Neill gets the idea to assign a task to his students to fail at something. Pick something they'll do that they know they won't succeed at. Brittany chooses to become less popular and gets the idea from Daria to bring up global concerns with the cheerleaders until she becomes ostracized. Kevin gets the idea to fail at being a quarterback for the team by intentionally throwing games until they kick him out. Jody tries to convince her parents to give her the summer off, but is given more work instead. Daria tries to convince her parents not to let Quinn go to a fashion extravaganza, but gets told to go with her to monitor her spending. And Jane gets the idea to become normal, eventually being offered Brittany's old position on the cheer team. But later, when Mr. O'Neill sees how depressed all of his students are over their failures, he feels like he's failed and shuts himself off from the world. After Jane realizes that her calling is not in fitting in with other people, she and Daria go to Mr. O'Neill's house to teach him his own lessons about failure, and he's reinvigorated to teach again, paying back Daria by escorting Quinn to the fashion show on her behalf. Mr. O'Neill tries to teach a lesson using failure, but himself fails to follow through on this lesson by explaining why the failures were learning experiences. Failure on its own teaches you nothing if you don't make an attempt to understand why the attempt failed in the first place. Picking an impossible task and then failing at it is a pointless endeavor. Picking something realistically achievable and then failing at it only teaches you what not to do. It's making multiple attempts and comparing them that makes the failures worth anything. That is, failure's a starting point of a journey, but not the first step. But sometimes failure can also be mitigated by simply changing your definition of the word. To make an attempt at something and then to look at the successes of what you did can make anything seem like a success overall. In fact, the only real failure is when you try something once and then never try it again. Sometimes success is less about winning and more about losing by less than you were expected to. And thinking any other way often results in anyone but the absolute best at a sport or competition feeling like they failed. Like the second smartest student in the school ought to have stopped trying because they're not the smartest, or a person running a very slow marathon feeling like a failure for not being the fastest, instead of comparing themselves to the people on the couch at home. I loathe a parade. Jake is trapped in the bathroom with no toilet paper and bribes Daria to go out to get some. But while she's out, she notices a huge crowd and finds out it's the day of the homecoming parade, and she's trapped behind the parade route. She meets with Jane, who's searching for Tom, then leaves, getting harassed by a lion mascot and then finding Tad searching for his parents. She takes the kid with her to find a responsible adult and comes across Tom, who suggests they climb a float in order to see further. This float is the fashion club's, and Daria has to threaten Quinn to get out of a makeover, while Tad admonishes the girls for using products tested on animals. The parade winds up stopping suddenly when Upchuck's car breaks down, and Brittany sees Kevin getting too friendly with another cheerleader, leading the others away, where a different float crashes while trying to avoid them. Tom and Daria watch the ensuing explosion together, with Daria feeling a bit of happiness with the guy before the two finally reunite Tad with his family and Jane with Tom. But then Daria gets paint spilled on her and tells the other couple to go on without her, while she returns home alone. A larger scale than episodes usually take, with cameo appearances from practically every character who's been in the show up to this point. While a majority of these are just background appearances, there are still a few longer callbacks, like Tad and Trisha appearing for the first time since the first season, with an appearance from their parents that implies the inherent worthlessness of the reward they give to Daria at the end. An extra carrot stick during her next babysitting job, despite the fact that such a job hasn't so much as been brought up since years ago. It's also an episode that takes a look at some of the development of Tad without Daria's guiding hand. He's back to his neurotic self, though with just a little bit of a more sense of indignance as he complains about the origins of some beauty products instead of remaining ignorant of the world. But who we also see without Daria's influence is Jane, painting with the rest of the art students and even splashing them with paint later, having a play fight with it, and then proceeding to act cheery and social. It's a change in her character, or at least a presumed one. All we've seen of Jane thus far is the way she acts around Daria and her brother. We don't really know who she is outside of the context of some of the more negative people in her life. So for someone like Tom to enter her life and her demeanor to change so suddenly is perhaps a sign that she's finally becoming who she wanted to be all along, if she's not changing completely. Of human bonding. Jake is planning on taking Helen to a business conference, but she has a last-minute change of plans and can't go. As Quinn is planning on inviting the fashion club to a sleepover, Daria volunteers to go with her father in order to avoid that get-together, as well as to visit a museum of human oddities nearby. While traveling to the conference, Jake tries to get to know Daria better, and Daria tries to be more open with her dad, but neither of them succeeds at this, until Jake meets with a famous franchisor, Barlow, and gets invited to go hot air ballooning with him, in spite of Jake's fear of heights. But Daria doesn't want to go up there when Barlow's assistant quits, and Jake winds up being launched alone, getting over his fear with Daria's help before the balloon crashes into a tree. Back at the house, Helen learns that her plans fell through after all, so she stays home with the fashion club. Sandy gets the idea to involve Helen in their makeovers to embarrass Quinn, and the two have nightmares over sabotaging each other's looks. The next morning, Quinn's guy friends come over, concerned that they haven't been able to reach her, and they see the girls without their makeup while Helen tries to ask for relationship advice. As it's been established before, Jake had a poor relationship with his father, but in his attempts to ensure that his father doesn't get the satisfaction of continuing to influence him, has made an active stride to ensure that he doesn't pass these traumas to his own children. What complicates this, however, is the fact that Jake doesn't quite know enough about parenting that does not involve traumatizing his kids. In his attempts to avoid the past, he has no present knowledge to pull from, but this isn't to say that he's a bad parent, just one lacking in experience. Jake tries to be a good father to his children, but his efforts come across as too little too late, though thankfully Daria is able to recognize the intentions for what they are, and calms her father down when he starts to panic over his failure, the type of thing only a well-adjusted child would know to do. Helen, too, tries to be more involved in the lives of her children, but often comes across as too absorbed in her own difficulties to be a better parent. Her own childhood was one of neglect, always getting less affection than her sister did. But as Helen considers herself to have turned out all right, she then passes on this lack of affection to her own girls, being detached from their wants and desires without realizing the extent of the problem, as she only knows what she knows. Psychotherapy. Helen is invited to a family therapy retreat to get an evaluation for a potential fast track to law firm partner. Daria makes a few facetious answers on the pre-screening questionnaire, while Jane sets up a 24/7 live stream of her bedroom. The family argues the whole way there, with Quinn resenting that they're not going to a real spa, while Helen argues with Jake over his newfound assumption that milk is a relaxant. Upon arriving, they're split into separate sessions, where Jake acts neurotic, Helen is work-obsessed, Daria keeps putting up barriers, and Quinn bores the therapist to sleep before listening in on Daria's session and getting hypnotized into thinking she's Cleopatra. Eventually, they have a group session where they each pretend to be one another, and Jake complains about how overbearing Helen is, while Helen calls Jake obsessed with his own suffering. She feels bad about this, and the family ultimately makes up in the parking lot. Jane also eventually takes down her live stream when Tom is embarrassed about shaking his butt in front of the camera. This episode takes all of the character development the Morgendorffer family has had over the last 3.5 seasons and spells it out in plain text for the audience, using the family's retreat as a way to justify doing so and being on the nose. Jake is constantly overlooked in the family, his desires being an afterthought to whatever the others want, but as he recognizes that it's selfish to think only of yourself, he can't really be more assertive without coming across as a hypocrite for demanding the very attention he resents others for having. Helen overworks herself, burying her nose in her career to cover up the fact that she spends too much time burying her nose in her career. It's hard to criticize a person for being too self-motivated and working too hard for those they care about, doubly so when that person retreats back into their work instead of trying to connect with the people and risking direct criticism. And then Quinn is so self-absorbed that if she were to try to open up to other people, she's afraid she might have nothing to open up about. She puts on an armor of vapid interest and surrounds herself with people too concerned with what's popular to ever risk saying something that might upset the natural order, like asking why something is popular. And so, despite all these family relationships, Daria ends up being explained as the most well-adjusted of the bunch. It's not as though she has a happy and healthy life or outlook on the world, but rather that she's self-aware enough that her problems are active choices, rather than irreparable flaws. The things Daria lacks are things she doesn't personally value. So despite outwardly appearing as an outcast from society, Daria knows what she wants and has just that, and very little more. Mart of Darkness. Jane has an argument with Tom when he eats some gummy bears she was planning to use for an art project. So she goes to Payday, a big box store, with Daria, who needs a new shoelace after Quinn steals one of hers to use to repair a broken accessory. The Lawndale football team is having a barbecue and Kevin is sent away with Brittany to buy sauce. Though when Brittany sees a locket that Kevin bought her on sale, she gets mad about the low price and demands a more expensive gift. The fashion club also goes to the store when Quinn doesn't bring enough sunscreen for all of them, only to be disgusted by the outfits the people there are wearing. Trent, Tom, and Jesse go to help Tom look for Jane and to get a new headlight, though Trent forgets to memorize the model of his van beforehand. Jane keeps trying to track down an elusive employee there, only to eventually corner Andrea from school, who assumes they're trying to make fun of her for her job before Daria and Jane admit that they have no intention of doing so. Mr. DiMartino also goes with the intention of eating the free samples, but he gets into a scuffle with the woman over cheese logs and accidentally shorts the power to the whole store. While back at the barbecue, Mr. O'Neill tries to convince Kevin's father to push his son to take schoolwork more seriously, only for his father to try to start a fight that results in a large scuffle in his backyard. Every conflict in this episode starts and hits its midpoint in the same way. Two people failed to communicate, and someone winds up at Payday. Jane is at first angry with Tom for eating a part of her art project, but every time she retells the story to Daria, she starts to realize that leaving them in a bowl in the kitchen unlabeled made it partially, and then almost fully, her own fault. Daria gets sent to the store to fix her boot, all because Quinn didn't ask for a shoelace, or at least an alternative way to fix her bag, and stole it instead. Then Quinn was directed there because she didn't know it was her job to provide sunscreen for the whole fashion club while they were outdoors. And some of these miscommunications wind up working out while others escalate, not just in severity, but in how little everyone else is talking. Mr. DiMartino goes into a frenzy over cheese logs because no one told him there was a limit of one per customer, and he's taking advantage of the fact. Kevin is blackmailed into buying more and more stuff for Brittany, as she never tells him when she's no longer mad. Mr. O'Neill and Kevin's father get into an argument on whether Kevin's grades should even matter, and this turns into a brawl when Miss Barch comes in to defend her man, expecting that he'll be attacked. But when Daria and Jane see Andrea working her job at the store, they offer not to communicate at all, saying they never saw her there and that they have no intention of damaging her reputation. Legends of the Mall. Jake's car breaks down and he panics as he was supposed to pick up Quinn and the fashion club from the mall. The girls attempt to take the bus home, only to wind up in a strange neighborhood, where they tell a ghost story about the Rattling Girl. This story takes place in the 60s, where a popular girl becomes self-conscious about how fat her eyelids are when someone says she's nearly perfect. So she goes on a diet and eventually becomes gaunt and frail, with her bones rattling every time she tries to dance. She's made fun of for this and vows revenge, running away where the clicking of her bones causes the other girls to lose beauty sleep for long enough that they all become too tired to be popular. Jake, wanting to prove he can do things the way he says he can, asks to have Trent drive the girls home instead, but his car breaks down near the woods and he tells the story of Metalmouth, a shop teacher at Lawndale during the 80s who was repeatedly mad at his students, grinding his teeth in anger until there were none left. Unable to afford dentures on a teacher's salary, he instead made his own set so the students would stop making fun of his speech impediment. But these metal teeth picked up radio signals, causing the taunts to continue, and he ran off into the night, occasionally biting down on cars driven by his former students. Trent's car winds up breaking down outside of a haunted house that Jane calls the House of Bad Grades. She tells the story of a nuclear family at the height of the Cold War, showing off their fallout shelter. But one of their daughters, tired of living in Lawndale, decides to write a college essay and enters the shelter for some peace and quiet. But when her father decides to pour concrete over the shelter to get a barbecue pit installed instead, the girl's trapped inside, where she becomes a spirit who haunts the homework of anyone living in the house. Ultimately, Quinn is just able to walk home, with Jake finding out the car broke down just a few blocks from their house. He returns home in time to finish putting lasagna in the oven, where Helen comes home and mentions that her car has been acting up, revealing a pair of metal dentures in the door handle. Groped by an Angel. After watching a special on guardian angels, Quinn starts to believe in a higher power, and when she narrowly avoids being crushed by a falling light fixture, she becomes convinced there's a guardian angel following her. Daria is annoyed with her new behavior as Quinn starts crediting every tiny thing that goes right for her to the angel, and decides to get back at her by going with Jane to Brittany's C-Average party to embarrass Quinn with her presence. But while there, Quinn spills diet soda on her pants and accidentally leans against some of Mystic Spiral's equipment, shattering a solid crystal bullhorn that was meant to be a gift for Brittany. She starts to fret that her guardian angel isn't real, but when Daria tries to rub it in, she feels bad about her sister's depression and says the angel was probably just busy to spare her feelings. Daria herself is agnostic in the sense that she hasn't put much thought into faith in the first place. It isn't a matter of forming an identity around non-belief, but that any sort of spirituality is too far removed from her more down-to-earth life experiences to waste effort in thinking about. Because to Daria, a person's actual faith is less relevant than the actions that faith encourages them to perform. If somebody talks a lot about how good of a person their belief makes them, but proceeds to use this belief to continue on looking down at others without themselves doing anything to justify their ego, then Daria views them as a bad person, religious or not. On the other hand, good deeds done without some desire for an eternal reward or karmic justice can be considered morally pure, as they are done for the sake of having done a good deed on its own. But then Daria ends up acting the hypocrite in this scenario, as Quinn starts to feel heartbroken over her supposed guardian angel abandoning her. By taunting her for her useless faith, Daria herself doesn't look any better, as she's using a lack of faith to justify in kicking her sister while she's down. So instead of giving a smug, "I told you so," as she would normally do, Daria cheers her sister up, since that makes her ideology valuable. Morality in life is so much more about what we do rather than why we do it, and taunting somebody for one thing while neglecting the other makes you just as bad. Fire. Jake accidentally sets the house on fire, and the family stays at a nearby hotel for the weeks that the house is being repainted. A bellboy named Bobby starts to flirt with Quinn, using the fact that his uncle works at the hotel to give her various gifts. Though a jealous Sandy tries to convince Quinn that she's actually being stalked. Ultimately, Jake and Helen, who were too relaxed to pay attention to what was going on, learn of what's happening when they're called into a detective's office, as Bobby was actually stealing the gifts meant for Quinn by erasing the charges on the hotel's computer, and Quinn freaks out over nearly dating a computer nerd. They also learn that Daria hasn't been in the hotel at all. She's instead been staying with Jane, though most of her time at Jane's house is spent talking to Tom instead, as the two have more in common with each other than they do with Jane. Eventually, Jane starts to argue that Daria is trying to steal her boyfriend, only to realize that she was overreacting, although Daria does consider that she has a point. Helen and Jake spend this episode happier than they've been in a long time due to the lack of stress they have because the hotel staff is taking care of everything for them, and the insurance company, as well as a few of Jake's connections, pay for all of them. But despite this lack of outside influence distracting them from their children, Helen and Jake are still no more attentive to what's going on with Daria or Quinn than usual. In fact, they're even less attentive to their children. There's an implication that the stress is what kept them alert enough to care. But what this episode is really about is the relationship of Daria and Tom burgeoning before Jane's eyes. Since Jane and Tom are dating and have been for a while, they've been together long enough to have arguments and to fight among themselves, something that Tom and Daria don't share because their relationship is much more casual. On the other end, Daria has a lot in common with Tom in terms of intellectual taste and why they like the works they do. There's a hint that Tom is only bothering to spend time with Jane anymore because Daria will be around as well, made more clear when he arrives at the Lane household and doesn't even check up on his girlfriend before spending the evening with Daria. Daria then hides behind ignorance, saying she wasn't actively trying to hurt Jane by spending so much time around Tom, but whether she was aware of it happening or not, Jane was still feeling hurt by all of this. And hurting somebody's feelings because you're trying to is sometimes not even as bad as hurting somebody's feelings because you don't care enough about them to bother checking. Die, die, my darling. Jane gets inspiration to dye tiger stripes into her hair and insists that Daria be the one to do it, in spite of her lack of experience. Daria is eventually talked into helping her friend, only for the entire process to consist of an argument about whether Daria is trying to date Tom. Eventually, Jane's hair is finished, and it's revealed that Daria did a terrible job, so Jane accuses her of sabotage and the two stop talking. Daria is comforted by Tom and the two share a kiss, while Jane has a conversation with Trent that makes her realize she was overreacting. When Jane finds out, she gets angry, only to have another conversation with Tom where the two break up officially, and Jane admits that Tom and Daria would make a better couple than she and Tom did. Meanwhile, Daria turns to her mother for advice, with Helen dropping everything to try to let Daria know things will work out, and the episode, and season, ends with Daria getting a call from Tom. Jane and Tom have drifted apart as they realize they have less in common with one another as they thought they did, made partially aware of this fact due to how well Daria and Tom are getting along, the way a real couple ought to. But Jane is still hesitant to admit this, in part because it makes the breakup seem like her fault for not working harder at it. So she has Daria dye her hair, despite knowing she doesn't have any experience. Also, she has a reason to be angry. After all, it's very difficult to be introspective and very easy to find someone else to blame instead. Jane believes that if Daria and Tom go out, it might justify her being upset about the relationship failing, as it would deflect responsibility away from her and towards the other couple instead. But as this truth gets revealed partially through conversations with Trent, Daria also has to admit that she's played a small role in the breakup. The fact that she was completely oblivious to what Jane was trying to do and took it all at face value means that she failed to understand what her closest friend really wanted. Being so oblivious to a person's feelings in this way can come across as willing obstinance at a certain point, where your only excuse for not figuring it out earlier is because you didn't care. But this is still somewhat of a stretch, as are Jane's motivations for the breakup in the first place. And through all of these confusing feelings, the girls are most upset with each other for not being there for a friend in need. Is it fall yet? Daria and Jane are still not on speaking terms after her kiss with Tom, as Jane goes off to an artist's retreat and Daria spends the summer at the OK to Cry Corral, a camp hosted by Mr. O'Neill due to her parents not wanting her to stay inside all season. She spends this trip disconnected from the kids until meeting Link, a child disturbed by his home situation, and she tries opening up to him, only for the kid to reject every offer to open up as he thinks Mr. O'Neill is putting her up to it. Elsewhere at the camp, Mr. DeMartino struggles to stay sane around all the children, until he finally snaps at Mr. O'Neill and takes them outside in spite of his wishes, only for the kids to cheer him on and reinvigorate his desire to teach again. Quinn hires a tutor as she is self-conscious about having the same PSAT score as the other girls in the fashion club, and she hires David, who nearly gives up on her when she doesn't seem interested in learning. But Quinn asks for a second chance and also winds up falling for the guy, even though the other girls of the fashion club also hired him, only to be dropped when they didn't care either. Ultimately, Quinn's test scores improve, and she tries to ask David out, only for him to turn her down as he thinks she has no depth. Kevin and Brittany get jobs working as lifeguards, but repeatedly fail at it, and are soon fired, giving Mac the idea to try to get fired from his job working on an ice cream truck, and getting yelled at by kids. Something he does only after raising enough money to take Jody out on a date as a break from the constant stream of work she's been doing at her parents' behest. At the art camp, all the other artists are sucking up to a celebrity artist named Daniel Dotson, except for Jane and a woman named Allison, who share a bond similar to her and Daria's. This comes to a head when Allison buys Jane dinner and tries to sleep with her, getting rejected before it's revealed she's also sleeping with Daniel and causing Jane to be a bit more disillusioned with the art world before returning to Daria. Daria has recently made proper contact with Link and gotten him to at last open up, and she admits that she is jealous of Jane's confidence. This results in her unbreaking up with Tom after she left him for trying to get her to go to an expensive art showing with his upper-class family, revealed as an excuse to avoid getting closer to the guy, who Jane finally convinces her to give the second chance to. This episode, or movie, is all about people learning things about themselves that the audience already knows, but that the characters themselves don't. These things range from the very simple, like Mr. DeMartino learning why he became a teacher in the first place, to the more complex, like Daria accepting that no one will accept her if she doesn't accept herself first. This is, ironically, the very thing that Mr. O'Neill tries and fails to teach the students at his summer camp, that they can't be open with others without accepting themselves first, and he winds up teaching Daria by sheer happenstance. It's Link and the antisocial behavior he exhibits that finally teaches Daria what kind of vibe she gives off, where she blocks off attempts by other people to get closer, and as a result winds up alone. It's something she thinks she wants out of life until she loses it by making a good friend and then losing Jane over a guy. Quinn realizes in this movie that she's actually much smarter than she gives herself credit for, because if she ever gave herself credit for being smart, she would get made fun of by the people she spends time around. So she dumps herself down in order to be more relatable to her peers, but this is something that David calls her out on. Spending time around stupid people is a way to ensure that you never have to be challenged, so Quinn has an excuse not to push herself because none of her friends do either. The friends you choose can say a lot about you, though Quinn eventually learns not to obsess so much over their judgment and to be her own person instead. Jane also discovers something about herself when she rejects the friendship of Allison, a person who often uses others to get what she wants out of them. Jane is convinced that she's found a kindred spirit, but rejects the comparison when she finds out who the other girl really was. This is put into direct contrast with her relationship to Daria, who revealed a new side of herself when she started going out with Tom, only for the two to break up afterwards. And instead of feeling bad about the entire event, Daria makes Jane feel better for it by admitting she admires how much Jane sticks to what she thinks is right, no matter what other people think of her. Even minor characters learn what they really want, with Jody eventually acknowledging that she actually likes being overworked, as it gives her something to define herself by, and that this is nothing she has to be ashamed of. Mac hates his job but likes the things it can buy, namely happiness for other people, and is willing to put up with things he finds annoying if there's a good end result. And finally, there's Daria, who in addition to realizing that she's closing herself off too much, also discovers that others are going to try to force her out of her shell if she doesn't leave it voluntarily. Daria rolls her eyes at Helen for forcing her to go to a summer camp as a counselor, and snaps at Tom for trying to introduce her to his family. At first, she claims that this is because she's being forced to do these things against her will, but eventually understands that this was just an excuse she made. It's not that she was being forced to open up, it's that she was expected to open up at all, that she had a problem with. But people only want you to be more open with them if they really like you, so maybe it's not so bad to be known. Season 5. While the show Daria began as a commentary on other, more reductive TV shows and the culture that spawned them, as the seasons went on, many of the tropes present in the works they criticize began to appear within the show itself. Daria went from looking down on the myriad high school dramas about teenage romance into a high school drama about teenage romance. But far from being accused of being hypocritical or forgetting their roots as a show, the writers managed to make these developments come across as natural, inclusions that are still commented on to make a point about why these things have proliferated so much in the first place, and what it means for those exposed to it all. It's still very much the social commentary it used to be, but now has the perspective of an insider being dragged into the scene, rather than an outsider looking in. Fizz Ed. Due to budget restrictions and their effect on the football team, Miss Lee decides to take up a contract with a soda company to have them advertise in the school, using a meeting on Super Bowl Sunday to discuss the event that only Daria and Jane show up to. The school is then flooded with ads and exclusive soda machines from Ultra Cola, which nobody seems to mind as their clubs are finally getting proper funding. Daria tries to get a few other students to complain, but they view complaining as her thing and refuse to get involved, which she eventually does anyway, only to have her complaints dismissed as an attempt at college credit. But soon the soda rep demands higher sales from Lawndale High, and the advertisements start to take over completely, with all of the students finally realizing things have gone too far after Miss Lee starts to offer extra credit for each can of soda the students drink, resulting in Kevin being too sick to play a football game and forfeiting. Realizing her contract may become void, she tries to force the students to drink more and more, eventually being hauled away for a psychotic break, and having the contract renegotiated to no longer include advertisements, at least inside of the school. The executive selling Miss Lee on placing advertisements in Lawndale High makes a point about ads being in every other part of the world, so inundating the kids with ads is just the way of preparing them for the real world. He's correct in this assumption, but this is an assumption predicated on a very pessimistic view of society. But this is also a view of society that makes an inaccurate assumption that this level of advertisement is positive or even sustainable. Even after the school starts supporting a specific brand, the return on investment isn't high enough, and they have to double down on how much they're pushing the product. There's an idea that if a company isn't making enough money, they just need to spend more and more till they see return, rather than the ads themselves becoming obnoxious enough to have the opposite effect. The advertisers have also failed to realize the extent to which they've oversaturated the market. Part of the reason why their increased spending isn't connecting with the audience. When ads are everywhere, you start to become experienced at tuning them out. So many of Lawndale students are fine with the ads because they don't notice them. Some of the more impressionable students might buy a few cans here and there, but more so because of the exclusivity agreement than anything else. So once they push further, they cross the threshold of diminishing returns on the ads, a dangerous line to cross as their earlier level of advertisement wasn't having any effect, and the later inundation only made people resent the product to which they were previously neutral. Sappy Anniversary. After hearing about her own 6-month anniversary with Tom from Quinn and seeing the gifts that Quinn's received from admirers, Daria starts to feel resentment towards Tom for not planning anything for their upcoming milestone. She wants to point this out to him, but feels like demanding something arbitrary to celebrate is a petty thing to do, but her feelings are made worse by finding out Tom would take Jane on fancy typical dates while they were still together. After getting a bit of advice from Helen on whether or not this matters, she eventually confronts Tom about her feelings, only to learn that the only reason he took Jane out on fancy dates was because he was trying to salvage their relationship towards its end. Ultimately, Daria and Tom agree not to worry about petty things because their relationship doesn't need that extra boost. Meanwhile, Jake gets hired by a tech startup but can't seem to figure out what they actually do. After trying and failing to explain his role with a bunch of buzzwords, they fire him from his job there, but also keep him on board as a one-man focus group to get in touch with their less tech-savvy customers. Daria has spent much of her life considering herself to be not like the other girls. By this, she means that she doesn't share their hobbies and interests, as well as showing more skepticism about the culture she's living in without blindly participating in it. But here, she starts to feel upset about missing an anniversary celebration, and then feels upset that she feels upset in the first place. Because she's put so much of her self-worth into not being like everyone else, only to then wish that she was just like everyone else. This longing goes contradictory to the core of her personality, and yet to ignore it would also make her unhappy as it makes her feel like she's being used in her relationship. She can either be dissatisfied with her past or dissatisfied with her present, and she'll feel like a hypocrite either way. But when she talks to Tom, Daria learns that her anxiety about her relationship is a normal thing to have for anyone. Tom himself was only leaning into the mainstream sort of dates, as he himself knew the relationship to Jane was faltering, and he was desperate to save it, trying things he would never ordinarily do. The fact that Daria and Tom aren't celebrating anniversaries means that they don't need to find an arbitrary reason to get together to do stuff, so they're still healthy. More importantly, it's okay to want to do more mundane things like other people do. This doesn't make you a mindless drone. That only happens when you want the same things as others without considering why. It's perfectly normal to come to the same conclusion as other people, as long as you're arriving at that conclusion by yourself. Fat like me. Sandy falls down the stairs during a fashion club meeting and breaks her leg, causing her to miss a few weeks of school as she recovers, with the fashion club having her call in to meetings in the meantime. But when Sandy does return to school, she's allegedly put on weight, and at a later meeting, she resigns from the fashion club due to their weight restrictions. Quinn is set to be the next president, but Sandy is able to convince her not to take the role and to resign instead, though Quinn decides to keep running things behind her back. Daria and Jane are making a series of bets on whatever's going on around them, and as they've both made bets on whether the fashion club will disband over this drama, Jane convinces Quinn not to betray her friends, while Daria convinces Quinn to help Sandy lose weight again. Just when it seems like the fashion club won't survive with only 2 members, Sandy comes back to school and Jane pays up. Sandy's comic obesity in this episode is something that would go unnoticed today, and was honestly acceptable even for the time this episode aired. It's an intentional way of pointing out the absurdity of beauty standards and how arbitrary many of them are. In the Victorian days, wide hips were considered the ideal female form. Then the flappers of the 1920s changed that for slim figures that their fashion accentuated. Then post-World War II brought back the desire for wider bodies before skinny was in again in time for Daria. Even today, the slim supermodel body is no longer idealized, as models instead get rated well for being thick with 2 C's. All of this to say that anyone getting butt implants today is going to be out of style in a few decades when standards arbitrarily change once again. This episode points out the fact that beauty standards are so absurd that only the truly shallow or self-conscious would ever possibly care so much about them, and so the shallow try to force others to be self-conscious about their body types in order not to stand out. Sandy is an incredibly shallow person, and she constantly tries to drag other girls down to her level. Otherwise, nobody will care about the things she cares about. The only characters who are happy throughout this episode are the ones who don't obsess over weight, meaning most of the cast. Even the guys at Lawndale, who are rarely shown to be especially smart, don't actually notice anything off about Sandy upon her return. The issue is entirely in the heads of the self-conscious. Camp Fear. Daria and Quinn visit the reunion of a summer camp that they went to as children, while Helen and Jake clean out the garage. As they're cleaning, Jake keeps finding things they bought for various vacations that either one of them canceled on due to work obligations. Daria reunites with Amanda, her only friend from the camp, only to try to ignore her just like she's ignored everyone else the whole time. After finally snapping at Amanda, the other girl upstages Skip, an overly enthusiastic group leader, and tells him off for bossing people around before encouraging the others to be like Daria in spite of her rudeness. Quinn meets up with her old friends, who reminisce on their truancy from the event before Quinn eventually brings up a guy she skipped a campfire with, revealing that the guy was the ringleader's date who she thought stood her up. For this, they refuse to give her a ride home, and she has to return with Skip instead of Trent and Jane, who have spent the weekend at the house of an elderly couple, as Trent believes that they have some sort of country wisdom, though, as Jane points out, they were actually just kinda dumb. Daria is lauded in this episode for being truthful, no matter how unpopular it makes her. And while Amanda is technically praising Daria for this staunch personality of hers, all Daria hears is a bunch of stuff about how bitter and lonely she is. She has a different revelation than the rest of the camp attendees. While they all start to rebel against doing whatever the most popular person in the group says to, she herself realizes that being miserable and lonely is the price of independence. At a certain point, you have to open yourself up to doing things you normally wouldn't be interested in, purely because that's what someone close to you wants. It doesn't mean you need to eschew your own interests entirely, but doing your second favorite thing instead of your first might be a better end result because you don't have to do it alone. After Amanda's speech, everybody starts to act more independently, meaning that nobody truly cared about what Skip was doing, and instead followed along to fit in with the crowd. This is the opposite behavior of Daria, and yet both of these groups seem to be equally unhappy with the ways things turned out. If you only ever hang out with people exactly like yourself, you'll end up hanging out alone. Even two very similar people like Daria and Jane have had their arguments requiring a bit of compromise to get over. The Story of D. Daria writes a short story with the intention of submitting it to a magazine, though she asks for Jane's opinion on it first and gets told it's not great. But after getting a second opinion from Tom and being remotivated to submit, she sends a copy to Musings magazine and awaits a response. But she's caught by Mr. O'Neill at the post office, and he accidentally lets slip to the whole class that Daria is an aspiring writer, making her feel even worse when she receives a rejection letter. Daria sulks about this and blames Tom for the bad feeling, though Tom tells her that the rejection letter asked her to try again, more than what most authors receive. Meanwhile, Jake finds an old show tune he wrote in military school and tries to get Daria to listen to it, part of what convinces her that the rejection letter was only bad because she had high standards. Quinn and the rest of the fashion club get the idea to sell a fashion magazine they wrote themselves to raise money for a new mirror for the bathroom. But when their fashion predictions don't come true, they worry about their reputations before learning none of the people who bought the magazine actually read it. They then decide to buy a plaque anyway. Daria refuses to submit her short story as she's afraid, not so much of rejection, but afraid of knowing whether or not the story is good. If she doesn't submit the story, she can pretend she's a good author without any risk of contradictory evidence. If she submits something and gets a positive result, that's fine, but the risk of failure is too high, to the point that Daria struggles to accept trying as an option. But the whole reason this risk exists in the first place has to do with the fact that her standards are too high. She's hoping to have the very first short story she ever submits get published, and to achieve recognition while trying as little as possible for it. What's worse than trying and failing is trying a second time and failing. Jake sings a show tune he wrote to Daria only to break down when she doesn't immediately praise the writing and quality. Seeing how broken up he is about a single failure puts Daria's ideas into perspective, because the worst case scenario she came up with is exactly what happened to her father. He failed once and has beaten himself up about it daily since then. It's somewhat pathetic behavior, but it's behavior Daria knows she can be better than. In fact, it's behavior that even Jake is better than, as the second he gets a few encouraging words, he starts to try again. And Daria has a supportive network of people around her, from the realistic critic of Jane to the supportiveness of Tom. Lucky Strike. The teachers of Lawndale go on strike to get a pay raise, leaving the classrooms in the hands of various substitutes, while Mr. DiMartino tries to renegotiate with Miss Lee. One of the scabs winds up trying to seduce a member of the fashion club and gets fired for it, so Miss Lee puts Daria in his place as a temporary teacher, a job she takes to make Quinn miserable. She tries to teach the class Shakespeare, but they're not great at paying attention, and a few even fail the final test, which was a single essay question asking the students to think for themselves. Among these failures are the entire fashion club except for Quinn, who Sandy tries to make fun of for being related to Daria, only for the other members to acknowledge they knew this all along and were just being polite. Meanwhile, Trent gets roped into helping the teachers write a protest song, while Jane assists in making their signs, before eventually the negotiations drag on long enough that Miss Lee signs a new contract by mistake, and the teachers can return to work. Daria's conflicted in this episode over her desire to not do anything and her desire to make Quinn's life miserable by being a teacher, getting a little bit of power over her and the other students. After a short deliberation, she takes on the extra responsibility, though as her short teaching career carries on, her focus shifts away from the original goal of embarrassing Quinn and more towards trying to uplift other students. Because Daria once thought that she was better than other people. In fact, she could basically prove it. But as she's engaging with them more and more frequently, she realizes that a lot of the stupidity in the world is less the fault of these stupid individuals, and more so the systems that elevate and reward that behavior. Quinn serves as a microcosm of this sort of culture in general. She isn't actually dumb, she just pretends to be popular. And after pretending you're a certain way for long enough, you eventually stop having to pretend. But Quinn is fighting back against this perception of herself, as exemplified when Daria assigns a simple assignment with the goal of gauging which students can think for themselves. Quinn manages to retain the information on her own, but more importantly, actually tries to get a good grade despite that not being a fashionable thing to do. Daria intended to embarrass Quinn by giving her good grades, as that would have made her unpopular. But Quinn chose to do well on her own, meaning Daria couldn't have hurt her even if she was trying to, and she's proud of her younger sister for acting this way. Art burn. While posing for a video, Mystic Spiral accidentally blows up the gazebo in the Lane family's backyard. As Wind was named in that gazebo, they make a plan to rebuild it, with Trent negotiating with construction crews while Jane sells her art at a fair to raise the money. While she's there, the owner of a gallery, Gary, scouts her and offers a job recreating famous works for him to sell. She's quickly able to pay for the gazebo, and then continues to copy paintings to make even more money. But between worries that she's losing her creative edge by copying others' work, and suspicions that Gary's passing her work off as originals, she launches an investigation into his clients, only to find that Brittany's father is one of them, and even he can tell the paintings are fake. So Jane decides to quit making copies so she has more time to work on her own art, and then forces Trent to finish working on the gazebo as she sympathized with the lazy workers he's hired too much. They finish the gazebo just in time for a visit from their parents, who decide to tear the structure down after mentioning that the naming gazebo story was fake. Meanwhile, the fashion club tries to convince Helen to sue a caricature artist for an unflattering picture of them, only to realize they lost the picture because Stacy kept it for herself. Jane is forced to make a decision during this episode between her desire for artistic integrity or money. It's not as though she's selling out entirely. Her passion lies in painting, and that's what she does. She also happens to be making money for doing so. It's not the exact future she had in mind, but it's closer than most people are going to get to living their dreams. But it's still not her dream, just someone else's. Jane looks for excuses to quit her job, trying to find some evidence that she's being exploited so she won't feel bad about telling her boss off, so she doesn't have to admit she's feeling burnt out for following her passion. In the end, Jane does choose integrity over profit, quitting her copying job to dedicate herself full-time to working on what she wants to. And not just her full-time, but her full energy as well. It is a nice position to take, and she's able to recognize it as such. Most people who work in creative fields don't have the luxury of making this choice. It's either painting things you have no passion for, or you miss a rent payment. Jane is from a fortunate enough background that she has the luxury of saying no to something that's not creatively fulfilling, but doesn't let herself feel any shame for this. One J at a time. Quinn starts to feel worried that she isn't mature enough as she hasn't found a steady boyfriend yet, and decides to find one of the J-boys to date exclusively. The fashion club encourages her to do this as they want the dating pool thinned out a bit for themselves, and Daria keeps pushing her to spend more and more time with a boy to get her out of the house. Helen also insists that Daria bring Tom over to meet the family, and Daria admits that she's afraid of the impression Jake might leave on the guy if that happens. So Helen makes a deal with Daria to talk to Jake about his recent squirrel obsession, in exchange for Daria inviting Tom over on the same night that Quinn chooses Jeffy, after exhausting other options. On the night of the dinner, Jake ends up bringing up the squirrel anyway, but the other guys insist on helping him trap the animal, leaving the woman alone. Quinn frets that she can't hold a steady boyfriend, but Helen assures her that real maturity comes from doing the things that make you happy, while Daria worries about her prediction coming true, although Jake, Tom, and Jeffy wind up having fun go-karting instead. Quinn struggles in this episode with her own identity, trying to show that she's mature enough by picking a single guy and dating him exclusively, but not maturing in her definition of what a relationship ought to be about. Because to Quinn, a relationship is something very one-sided. She is a selfish lover, but the guys who are after her are more concerned with one-upping each other that they never have the time to realize this. When she becomes exclusive with the guy, she quickly overwhelms him. This is in part because of the fact that Daria and the fashion club are offering her bad advice for selfish ends, but also in part due to the fact that Quinn is trying to define herself by the people she's around. She's hoping that her boyfriend will become a part of her identity. After all, she's just lost a part of her identity by refusing to let men fight over her in the first place. Instead, trying to define herself first, and then find someone else who meshes well with that. This is also in part what defines Daria's anxieties in this episode. Her family is nothing like her, Jake least of all, and she's worried that Tom will start to make an impression of Daria by the impression her family leaves, or worse, the other way around. Helen and Jake may put up with Daria's attitude because she's family, but if Tom acts the same way, they may not be so tolerant. Of course, Jake and Tom are able to bond over manly things like a squirrel hunt, and Daria's worry was probably misplaced to begin with, as Tom is surely changing himself a bit for Daria's sake, the same way she was trying to hide her family from him. Life in the past lane. Tired of being a third wheel, Jane follows a retro-dressed man into a thrift store and starts to flirt, eventually dating Nathan, who constantly dresses and acts like it's the 1940s. Daria and Tom make fun of his fashion sense, which annoys Jane as she resents that they can't see the fun in it. The two go on a few more dates where, despite a few moments of Nathan obsessing with his hair, they seem to be getting along more, and they eventually invite Daria and Tom to a drive-in, though the two refuse to actually participate in any of the old-school partying. The next day, Jane buys tickets to see Upchuck perform a magic show where he'll be trapped inside of a locked box, but Nathan refuses to go, eventually arguing with Jane about the authenticity of her outfit before they break up, with Jane admitting that she only got into the relationship out of a jealousy of what Tom and Daria had. Back at the magic show, Stacy's revealed as his assistant, much to the disgust of the fashion club, at least until his botched trick is revealed as a ruse and Quinn and Tiffany start to praise her acting abilities. Nathan's obsession with the past is at first viewed as a simple quirk of his personality, the type of thing that Daria's dismissal of turns into an aspect of refusing to find fun in life. She views it as corny, insincere, and worst of all, not something Jane would do unless she were forcing herself to try to fit in with the new guy. But just because it's out of character for Jane to behave in this way doesn't mean it's impossible for her to enjoy life by pretending it's the 40s. People change for their significant other all the time. Heck, in Season 1, the idea of Daria going steady with the guy would have been absurd. But as the episode goes on, it's revealed more and more that Nathan doesn't just like the 40s, he loves them. His enthrallment is more of an obsession, and it's actually Nathan who doesn't see the fun in the activity, rather than those around him. The B-plot of this episode has Upchuck putting on a magic show, at first on street corners where he hustles miscellaneous passers-by before his solicitations catch the attention of Stacy, despite the rest of the fashion club dismissing it. But uncharacteristically, Stacy continues to go along with the tricks until the night of the performance, where she is then ostracized for publicly associating with magic. And then the trick happens, and people come around. The last season of Daria has put more focus on people who eschew social norms being rewarded for doing so, as these norms aren't actually things people want to do, but things people are roped into for popularity. And the second you stop caring about being popular, you can actually become popular. Aunt Nauseum. Aaron, Daria's cousin, is getting divorced, and Rita, Daria's aunt, asks Helen to manage the legal side of it. Despite Aaron not actually arriving as she's on a vacation in Switzerland at her grandmother's expense, and the fact that Helen doesn't specialize in divorce law, she still agrees, though things are made difficult by the fact that Helen's accused of not caring for trying to pass the case to a colleague, more qualified, and that Jake is hiding out in the garage until all the women leave. So Daria calls for backup in Amy, not only to defuse the situation with Rita and Helen, but to talk to her about Quinn acting as though she wants something, and the fact that she no longer has time for Tom. But Amy gets involved in the arguments almost immediately, with the others accusing her of doing whatever she wants and then blowing off the family if they become inconvenient. Finally, Daria and Quinn start pretending to fight in front of the others to make them realize how cruel they've been acting, and the sisters make up. Daria then learns from Quinn that she's been trying to get closer out of fear that they may become like their mother's side of the family one day, and that Daria's been blowing off Tom because she's worried about the prospect of marriage in general. Many sitcoms will have dysfunctional families as a source of comedy, and just a little bit of drama, though never so much as to make the jokes age poorly. In Daria, the poor relationship of the Barksdale family woman is taken a lot more seriously, with the implications behind their scuffles getting more explanation. Rita has always been the center of attention, viewed as the golden child by her parents, much to the annoyance of the others who are constantly overlooked. Yet, Rita is also the one closest to her parents. It's a recursive situation. They treated her better, so she's around more often, so they treat her better, and so on. Helen always tries to stand out by overperforming at everything she does, and as a result, has a superiority complex. In spite of resenting her sister for getting more attention, she herself wants more attention than the others. And Amy gets overlooked by everybody, doing her own thing without her family as long as it's convenient. This sort of relationship can, at its worst, come across as all take and no give, making it no surprise why she is often overlooked because she wants it that way. Not that this stops her from complaining about the consequences of her own actions. And all of this squabbling ends up creating two real victims, Daria and Quinn. They have to watch their family drama play out before them, wondering if they'll wind up being nasty and bitter too one day because they have no positive role models to look up to. But the very fact that Quinn and Daria worry about one day hurting one another means that they're already many steps ahead of the older generation, who acted without consideration. And of course, Daria doesn't have to worry about divorcing a man over a bad relationship as long as she never lets that relationship sour the way so much neglect can. Prize fighters. Helen encourages Daria to enter the running for a scholarship to make up for her lack of extracurriculars, so she looks online and discovers a wizard scholarship competition. Daria tells Jody about the scholarship and her indecision on whether to apply, and Jody tells Upchuck as well. Daria's sardonic essay makes her a finalist alongside the other two, with Daria upset that Jody expanded the field of competition, while Jody defends her decision by saying that Daria didn't seem interested in the first place. After seeing the lengths that the others are going to impress the interviewer, she then signs up for an interview coach who encourages her to be untruthful about her enthusiasm. Daria even tries to dissuade Jody from continuing by pointing out the discriminatory hiring practices of Wizard, but this only motivates her further. In the end, Jody and Upchuck both suck up during the interview, but Daria refuses to do so, and none of them get the money. Daria then apologizes to Jane, who also apologizes for acting jealous of all the smart kids in their college funds. The episode ends with Jake trying to offload a bunch of bulk hot dogs he accidentally ordered by hosting a hot dog eating contest. Daria and Jane once shared a bond over their mutual disdain of the world, that while everyone was concerned with conformity, they would look down on people who lacked the ability to think for themselves. But as the show has gone on, the miscellaneous side characters who made up faces in the crowd have been developed. Jody's not just a classmate, but a woman with her own goals and ambitions. Upchuck isn't just some sleaze, but has a few genuine talents and is more likely a product of a toxic home environment. And more shocking than any of these is the fact that Daria is starting to drift away from her old detachment, as her life moves in a direction that makes disdain and success impossible. She will one day have to pretend she finds her boss's ramblings interesting, or go to a job interview and pretend to be passionate about spreadsheets. There's not much room in society for a pessimist, so Daria will either adapt or get left behind. And what makes adaptation hard is the fact that she's pretending to be somebody else, and that this is a person Jane won't pretend to be. She struggled with selling out herself this season, but even then, the direction her life is bound to take will still eventually cause her to wind up separate from Daria. As they go on with their lives, sticking together becomes harder and harder to do. They'll drift apart, not because they want to, but because they have to. My Night at Daria's. Tom is at Daria's house one night, and the two of them take shelter from Quinn's noise in her room, where they eventually fall asleep. A drunken Jake catches Tom sneaking out after 4 a.m. and tells Helen, who makes enough noise about it that Quinn overhears, and the rumor soon spreads to the rest of Lawndale. In spite of Daria's insistence that nothing happened between them, people keep congratulating her and Tom, so she calls Jane to set the record straight. They conclude the best thing to do is to start a rumor about Quinn having toe fungus, so the school moves on. But that still leaves the lingering question of when Tom and Daria are actually going to have sex. Daria believes that their relationship would be suffering without physical intimacy, and agrees to sleep with him the following Saturday. But her nerves get to her and she instead writes him a letter where they break up. But Tom confronts her, saying that she is sending mixed messages, but also that he doesn't want her to rush things. In the end, Daria is able to clear things up with her mother and start talking to her father again, who has spent the episode concerned with a parasite he got from a sushi restaurant that he's trying to represent. Most people's first reaction to the news that Daria and Tom have had sex is to congratulate the couple on the milestone in their relationship. Then, upon hearing that it wasn't true, they awkwardly try to back out, saying that abstinence is also fine. There's a weirdly sex-positive vibe given from a bunch of people who refuse to actually say sex and come up with awkward euphemisms instead. People try to come across as supportive, but not too supportive, and then retroactively not supportive at all, when the opposite is revealed, and it leads to an awkward situation where Daria sees the praise as a logical follow-up to her relationship moving forward, as if sexual intercourse was a matter of when instead of if. So Daria faces the same decision she has faced since the start of the series, whether to do the thing everyone expects of her or not. This time it's complicated by the fact that she now cares about what others think, perhaps not the mainstream crowd, but Tom is eager to advance their relationship in this way. So she gets pressured into having sex, not by Tom, but society in general, and ultimately fails to actually go through with something she doesn't want to do, feeling like a failure as a result. Daria wants to get closer to Tom, but wants to do this on her own terms, resulting in a mixed message being sent that's finally cleared up with frank explanations of what they do and do not want to do. The opposite of the euphemisms and roundabout talk directed her way earlier in the episode. Boxing Daria. The Morgendorfer family gets a new refrigerator, and Daria suddenly becomes obsessed with the box, daydreaming about it and having flashbacks to a fight her parents once had. Despite dragging it to the curb for garbage pickup, Daria continuously brings it back, eventually crawling inside as it's calling to her, where she remembers the fight in more detail. When her parents won't talk to her about it, she decides to drive to Tom, who's 4 hours away at a family wedding she at first refused to go to. But along the way she nearly crashes her car in the rain, and Jane drives over to talk to her. Upon returning home, she confronts her parents, and they admit the truth. They had a big fight over Daria not fitting in at school, but she was merely the topic of the fight and not the sole cause. They say they're aware that Daria doesn't fit in, but also that it's a choice of hers that comes as a result of her being so smart. Realizing the difficulty she's made for her family, and how tolerant they've already been of her, Daria changes her mind on an earlier opportunity, volunteering to give campus tours to incoming freshmen at Lawndale. One of the main reasons that Daria has always struggled to fit in with the others at her school is the fact that she herself doesn't want to. While a character like Quinn has spent a few seasons pretending to be somebody she's not to get more friends, Daria refuses to compromise on her personality, and this has earned her little popularity, though by design. And yet, the few friends she does have are people she cares about deeply, so her refusal to compromise on her ideals regularly puts her in awkward situations with them. She'll have fights with Jane over their differences and then refuse to let Tom get any closer, despite wanting him to. Daria has the independence she originally wanted, but now she's regretting her life choices as she no longer knows how to interact with other people on the off chance that she wants to. So the real issue she faces isn't just her desire for independence, but the fact that this is a nearly impossible goal to achieve. No matter how she lives her life, there will be other people in it, and refusing any closeness to those people will only make life harder for yourself, and worse, harder for them. She cares about Tom, but then puts him in an awkward position of having an emotionally unavailable girlfriend. She cares about Jane, and Jane's willing to rush through a rainstorm just to see if she's okay. But would Daria do the same? Or is that a form of attachment that she spent her life rejecting? Does it make you a hypocrite to care? And of course, in spite of the argument she's had with her family, they still very much care for her, and she's been as much a pain to them as they've been a pain to her. Quinn is almost justified in wanting to distance herself from Daria, as Daria is not just asocial in rejecting her own social life, but antisocial in rejecting the social lives of others. Is it college yet? Daria and Jane, and practically every other student at Lawndale, are concerned with their college applications. Daria's parents both consider Middleton as a good option for her, but she has ambitions of the more prestigious Raft and the even more prestigious Bromwell, where most of Tom's family graduated. She goes on a campus tour with some of the Sloane family, where Tom tells old family anecdotes while Daria stutters through her interview. He ends up getting into Bromwell while Daria is waitlisted, not good news for her chances. Tom offers to give her a letter of recommendation from his parents, but she refuses to take him up on this. Meanwhile, Jane is rejected from her only two choices of normal colleges while trying to put together a portfolio for Boston Fine Arts College, or BFAC, and ultimately decides, with help from Trent, not to go to college after all. Jody is intent to go to Turner, a historically black university, where she won't have to concern herself with being a model token minority, but her parents refuse to hear her out, especially after she gets into Bromwell. But when Mac finds out how much she's upset by this, he confronts her parents, telling them she applied to Turner behind their backs and convincing them to accept her real first choice instead. Brittany and the other cheerleaders all get into the same local college, but Kevin is secretive about where he's going, insisting that Brittany make promises about staying with him no matter what. It's ultimately revealed that he failed his senior year and will be repeating, which makes Brittany second-guess her decision to stay with him in spite of his immaturity. Mr. O'Neill tries to comfort Miss Barch while she's mourning the anniversary of her divorce, which she takes as a marriage proposal that Mr. O'Neill is too timid to break off. So Mr. DiMartino vows to assist his friend in growing a spine and telling Miss Barch how he really feels, which gets him a black eye. But when she returns later to give him a piece of her mind, she reveals that she actually likes Mr. O'Neill's newfound backbone and starts to pursue him once more. Stacy wishes for Sandy to stop talking for her birthday, only for Sandy to get laryngitis the next day, losing her voice. Stacy feels upset that she's cursed her friend and orders a curse reversal online, only to give Tiffany an allergic reaction instead, where Sandy gets mad at the other girl for finding out about the curse. Quinn gets a job as a hostess at a nearby restaurant in order to pay off credit card debt she's accrued, and quickly makes friends with one of her co-workers, Lindy. Lindy invites her to a few college parties, where Quinn is shocked to find out how non-judgmental the other people are there, giving her a change of pace from the judgmental nature of the fashion club. But Lindy gets revealed as an alcoholic when she keeps trying to drive home drunk after a night of partying, and when she shows up to work, still drunk, gets fired. But not before trying to blame her drinking on Quinn. Quinn confronts her for her problem, but Lindy refuses to admit she has an issue, and goes back to her own lifestyle, while Quinn returns to the fashion club with a new perspective, one that, when combined with the demands a now healthy Sandy is making of Stacy, causes the girls to realize it's not worthwhile to spend time around her, and the fashion club breaks up, though they still plan hangouts to talk about fashion later. Daria finds out Jane has given up on college, and the two make a deal. Daria will ask Tom for a letter of recommendation, while Jane will actually submit her portfolio. But despite doing this, Daria still doesn't get into Bromwell and decides to break up with Tom, as they're too different and the long-distance relationship won't work out. Though Tom still agrees that they'll still call each other every so often as just friends. Jane submits her portfolio and gets into BFAC, with Trent admitting that he didn't want her to submit it as he would miss her, though it's still for the best that the two decide to move on with their lives. At the end of the movie, Daria is recognized for overcoming adversity with the Diane Fossey Award. Diane Fossey lived among apes for several years, and she is forced to give a speech to the whole class. She approaches the podium with the intention of finally telling off all her old peers and complaining about how much high school sucks. But instead, she mentions how there's no problem too big to overcome and that good friends, good family, and pizza can overcome just about anything. It's a seemingly out-of-character thing for her to do, to pass on the opportunity to be pessimistic and to instead say something sappy and even a bit uplifting. But this whole movie has been about characters acting like different people due to the journeys they've been taking to get to where they are. Quinn has been a follower for her whole life, going along with what the more popular people around her are doing without giving much thought to why she's acting this way. But after several seasons of Sandy becoming more and more bitter, she gets a wake-up call by going to a college party and seeing that it's possible to put yourself up without putting someone else down, and the only reason she spent so much time putting others down was to avoid being insulted herself. People are more likely to like you if you're nice than if you're mean, as the real world is a much bigger place than a high school, if someone is nasty, you can just avoid them. Jodie has placed a lot of her self-worth in the things that she does, but after years and years of having to be a role model for her race, she just wants to be around people who accept her for who she is instead of the things she does. Her parents push her into a much more active lifestyle, but only because they themselves have had to work hard to overcome race-related obstacles. It's not until they realize how similar their lives and struggles are to hers, they finally accept that maybe she ought to live the life she wants to instead of what they want. And then she can figure out who she really is, instead of who she's pretending to be. Jane and Daria have bonded frequently over their disdain for the rest of the world, and in the earlier seasons this was a justified opinion to have. They really were better than other people. But these side characters have become more and more developed over the last few seasons, to the point that their motivations have become clear. And invariably, the negative traits of the personality have all been reactions to expectations society places on them. And so Daria herself confronts the idea that perhaps she's only been so dismissive of others because she was judging them for surface-level traits. Daria finally realizes that if she keeps closing herself off to other people, then she'll remain that way. It's best to judge people by their best traits if those are the traits you want to see more of from them. Society constantly pressures us to be the worst versions of ourselves, so it's important when judging other people to understand the pressures that made them that way, as well as the fact that these same pressures are influencing your life as well. And all of this banality and toxicity can be overcome with a few good friends sharing a pizza together while being honest. Outro. There have been recent talks of a revival of Daria through a spin-off that would have focused on Jodie, titled Jodie. After a few years of these talks, this was scaled back to a direct-to-TV movie, which was ultimately dropped by MTV in 2022, leaving the future of the franchise in a questionable state. Though fairly well-received revivals of Beavis and Butthead still show some hope for the idea behind maintaining the franchise. There's probably one comment that a lot of people watching this video have already typed out most of, assuming they haven't sent it already. One complaint that I'm anticipating due to a glaring aspect of the show that I'm yet to bring up, and that's the big F word: feminism. It's not a doubt that the writers for Daria were deep in the trenches of third-wave feminism. Characters would represent concepts and talking points, with episode plots routinely running adjacent to these topics. Even when less overt, the material would still be shown, whether it was an assignment on the blackboard behind a teacher, or a book Daria would be reading at the start of a scene. This may come as a shock to you, the viewer, but I am a man. Maybe my voice made it obvious, but in case you're the type to refuse to jump to the conclusion, this is the case. One of the main reasons that I never broached the subject has to do with the fact that I'm not really the guy to be making these points. There's enough content on the internet that consists of dudes talking about feminism that I don't really need to throw my takes onto the pile. That and the fact that the face of feminism has changed since the show's creation to a much more positive effect. In spite of some of the anti-voices becoming louder, many ideas that were radical at the time are now much more pedestrian and acceptable. It's like a person making a passionate argument in favor of women's suffrage today. It would feel unnecessary, as there's not a large skeptical crowd of the idea. In this same sense, the people who find it strange that Helen was the breadwinner of the Morgendorfer household were once most of the audience, but today it's a character trait that passes by unnoticed by any but the most fringe weirdos. So Daria has aged a bit in its messaging, but for the better. This is why I've opted to ignore some of what the show was about, not only because I'm not the guy to raise these points, but because the points have been made frequently enough that they don't really need to be raised again, meaning that I was able to focus on what Daria means through a modern lens, to make a video about the parts of the show that are so universally relevant. Thank you for watching this far into the video, or if you just skipped around a bunch, that's fine too. These videos aren't really meant to be watched in one sitting, nor are they really intended to be watched at all. Rather, put on in the background while you do chores, or clean, or play a video game, or work out, or whatever. Speaking of which, if you are just listening to this video in the background, here's your warning to start looking for something else to watch before it ends. I would recommend one of my own videos, but, of course, I am very biased in this regard. It's been over a decade since I last watched Daria, and this was the first time I watched the show start to finish in this way. I found it a nice little time capsule of the late 1990s and the sardonic detachment of so many people during this time. and I certainly have a better understanding of the way that so many who spoke sarcastically and looked down on the world have since matured out of that mentality. Though this isn't to say that it wasn't still a valuable moment of life to start to question the social systems surrounding you. I think everybody ought to question authority at some point in their lives, the moment where you wake up from drifting through the world and ask, is this really the best that we can do? And sometimes, but not all the time, the answer to that question is yes, given the circumstances. The world is a complex and scary place, but it's like that for everybody. Looking down on your neighbor for using the coping mechanisms they use isn't productive behavior, and at the end of the day, even if you don't perfectly get along with another person, there's still much more to be gained from a bit of compassion, as we all reward each other for surviving yet another day with the weight of the world standing on our necks.